So my major question is, how the did the Supreme Court rule in his favor? Dare I say segregation by religious belief? This bill is halfway on its way to introducing religion in schools again. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Common Sense Call. Today we're going to do a deep dive into something that is near and dear to my heart, which is education. Today we're going to talk specifically about legislation, laws, etc. that has been pushing religion back into public schools. When I say religion, I mean Christianity. And yes, you heard that correctly. Christianity is back in public schools. Now, this whole topic of religion in schools is very important to me because as an educator, I have learned that public school is not a place for religion. And I say I have learned because when I started out in my career as a teacher, I was a Christian, and I did, unfortunately, do some subtle pushing of Christianity onto my students. But the more time I spent in the classroom, the more time I spent learning about my students, I realized that religion should never be in the classroom. And I would also argue that religion, politics, personal opinions don't have a place in the classroom. It is all about the student and guiding their education so they can have a better future. I don't know how many people are aware of what is going on regarding religion and education, because all I have heard about is woke ideology back in schools, and several conservative right-wing Christians. And all I have heard about is stuff from right-wing conservative Christians in an uproar about woke ideology. I should put that in quotes, woke ideology in public schools, and that people need to protect their children, get them out of public schools. It's so dangerous for them. And all of this is happening while for the past 5-ish years, these same people have been pushing for religion back in public schools. But I don't hear people talking about this. So I'm here to talk about it. I'm here to bring the uproar. So let's dive in. To give a quick overview, this is a long video. We are going to start with the Establishment Clause, discuss what exactly it is, how it has been interpreted over the years, why it was established. Then we're going to get into a few court cases in the early 2020s before we dive into a state-by-state analysis of more recent legislation that is currently on the table or has just recently been passed. So I know you probably don't want a history lesson, but the first part is crucial as we discuss what the Establishment Clause is. Is there really a separation of church and state? Because all of that is now being interpreted in a completely new light, and that is what people are basing their new legislation on. So bear with me. I will put a disclaimer. I'm not a historian. I am not an expert on this. This is just based off of my extensive research into the topic. So if you have anything to add, please feel free in the comments. I would love to hear it. So with all that said, grab your tea, grab your popcorn, and let's dive in. All right, let's talk about the Establishment Clause. What is the Establishment Clause? If you don't know what it is basically the part of the Constitution that says essentially that there is a separation of church and state. Does it say those exact words? No. And you will hear that argument a lot from conservatives and Christians who are pushing for this legislation that we're going to get into. You're going to hear them say that the Constitution never actually specifies that there should be a separation of church and state. It does not use those words. It does not specifically say that, so it doesn't exist. And I beg to differ. So what the Establishment Clause says is that essentially the government should not favor one religion or non-religion over the other. So does it say separation of church and state? No. But does it say clearly that those two should be separate and that they shouldn't support one over the other? Yes. So the phrase separation of church and state is, in my opinion, a summary of the Establishment Clause, what it means in practice, right? Now, I want to talk about a little bit of history here because it's very interesting that the first supporters of the Establishment Clause were, in fact, religious. Okay. If you remember back all the way to your middle school, high school history lessons, the first people who settled in this area, a lot of them were seeking religious freedom. Many groups, like the Quakers, were specifically looking to separate themselves from the government, the religious government of countries like England at the time. So they were supporters of this Establishment Clause because they wanted the freedom to practice their own, I guess you could say, version of Christianity. They did not want a repeat of the Anglican Church control over the government like it was in England. So dissenting faiths like the Presbyterians, Quakers, Baptists, They supported the Establishment Clause because they saw what religion and government together did in England, and they said, no, we don't want that. So we want the freedom to practice our own religion. We don't want a government that specifically supports one religion over another or non-religion over another. So in these early stages of the Establishment Clause, when it was first written, it was more about different religious groups wanting to avoid one group taking control over the other. It wasn't necessarily a lot of what we see today, which is atheist versus Christian or non-Christian. It was more of people of a similar religion looking to practice as they see fit. And again, we have to keep in mind that religion was the norm in the 1800s, okay? Most people were religious. Whether they actually practiced and believed is another question, but religion was the norm. So that means that even supporters of the Establishment Clause, like Jefferson and Madison, still somewhat mixed religion with the government because, again, that was the norm. But overall, people wanted the government to not have one specific religious affiliation. That was why the Establishment Clause was written. So we have this whole long period during the 1800s where the Establishment Clause prevented religion from overtaking the government and getting too involved in the government. But in education, there was still often religion involved. And we're going to see that mentioned again later on when we look at legislation. Further clarification of what the Establishment Clause actually meant regarding education didn't occur until around the 1940s. Multiple court cases occurred during the 1940s and in following decades trying to determine what the Establishment Clause exactly meant in practice in education specifically. Because like I said, there was already religion mixed in with education in previous years. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that people said, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't quite seem right. So there are several court cases, like I said, trying to establish guidelines on how to determine whether something violated the Establishment Clause. Most notably was the Lemon versus Kurtzman case in 1971, which essentially established the Lemon test to see if something violated the Establishment Clause. And there were some later adjustments to this Lemon test, but it essentially decided that the government can assist religion only if, 1, the primary purpose of the assistance is secular, 2, the assistance must neither promote nor inhibit religion, and 3, there is no excessive entanglement between church and state. Now, clearly, this Lemon test left a lot of ambiguity. For example, what does excessive entanglement mean? That's very subjective and can be interpreted multiple ways. And because of this ambiguity, the Establishment Clause has been interpreted differently, and the Lemon test has been applied differently by different federal judges across different court cases. Now, in 2022, a pretty important case, which we're going to talk about in more detail in a few minutes, but this case in 2022 essentially overturned the Lemon test, unfortunately, claiming that the Establishment Clause should be interpreted and evaluated based on a more historical lens, aka looking at things as if we were in the 1800s and what people in the 1800s would have done, which, in my opinion, is ridiculous. So what does all of this mean? In my opinion, the separation of church and state and its implementation is a bit blurry, or perhaps I should say it has always been a bit blurry. And like I said, there were several court cases that tried to establish some guidelines on interpreting the Establishment Clause. And what they generally seem to care about is whether government funds are going to support a specific religion or non-religion. So I'm going to quickly go through a few cases that outline this. Again, not a history lesson, just bear with me. Okay. So Everson versus Board of Education. This decided that the school board can provide bus transportation both for public school and Catholic school because it shows no favoritism between religion or non-religion. Okay, so where are the funds going? The funds are in the buses, the bus drivers. Where are those going? Are the funds going specifically to a non-religion school or specifically to a religion school or to both equally? No favoritism. Okay, again, funds. Where are the funds going? The second court case is the Santa Fe Independent School District versus Doe. This one is very important since, again, it is referenced in current legislation that is pending. And the case decided that students could not use, I repeat, could not use a school's loudspeaker system to offer student-led prayer since the speaker system was paid for by the school and therefore the government. Okay, so where are the funds going? The government funds going to the school. The government pays for the loudspeaker system. You can't use that to do a school-wide prayer. because, again, funds. Now, this is a more recent version of the very famous court case Engel versus Vitale? I don't know. I'm sorry. And this case occurred in 1962, and it is, again, another case that is very often cited by current legislation. And this court case established that there could be no daily prayer recitation, even if voluntary, since it was financed by the school and therefore the government. Okay, so no prayer in public school. Does it seem straightforward? Obviously, yes. But unfortunately, this case is being cited as a way to support religion coming back in schools. It's crazy. Again, we'll talk about it later on. But this is why these cases are so important, okay? Because current legislators and legislation, they are twisting some of these court cases and history to their favor. Okay, so this is why it's important to understand this foundation. All right, moving on, we have another case that happened right after the Engel versus Vitale case. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation. We're just going to go with that. And this case is called Abington Township versus Shemp. Okay. Now, this case focused more on Bible reading rather than prayer, but it is just as important. Okay. So at the time in 1963, there were two court cases occurring, one in Pennsylvania and one in Maryland. And the Supreme Court decided to combine these into one case called the Abington Township versus Shemp. Now, in Pennsylvania, there was a law that dictated that public schools had to read from the Bible at the beginning of each school day. A student could decide to leave, but I mean, they're still reading the Bible. And district court said that this was unconstitutional for obvious reasons, but the state law said it wasn't. So that case was elevated to the Supreme Court. And at the same time, the Maryland state law allowed public school Bible reading and recitation of the Lord's Prayer. And of course, atheist groups fought against that. And ultimately, these cases were elevated to the Supreme Court together. And the court ruled that both practices were unconstitutional due to their very obvious religious nature. And rightly so. So there we have 4 court cases that have clearly outlined that there should be no prayer, no Bible reading, no government funds going towards religion in any way. Okay? Very clearly stated 4 court cases. And those are important, again, because current legislators are twisting what they say. Okay. Moving on. Now, these court cases brought up a question for me. If religious expression is not funded by the government, is it still unconstitutional when it occurs in public schools? Or is it just when the government is funding something? For example, if a teacher does some sort of religious expression in public school, is that constitutional? You might be saying, well, of course not. It's public school. They can't do that. And I would also agree. However, according to a recent court case, it is constitutional. So that leads us to the aforementioned 2022 court case, which is called Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. And again, I did not hear about this court case when it happened. I feel like there should have been so much more news surrounding it. This is utterly outrageous, in my opinion, and people should have been on the streets protesting this. So in 2022, prayer in public schools again came to the forefront of a Supreme Court case. Like I said, Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. But this time it is in regards to prayer and sports. So this Coach Kennedy, for several years, he led the team in team prayers. And he also gave them motivational speeches, as a coach would do. But his speeches had some religious undertones. And when I say religious, I mean Christian. Okay. And several years passed. And finally somebody, I don't know how it surfaced that he was doing this or why it took so long for people to realize this, but eventually the school found out and asked him to stop. Now, he did stop the motivational speeches with some religious concepts, but he did not stop praying, and he continued to pray on the field, and students joined in the prayer with him. Ultimately, he was suspended from his job for obvious reasons. Now, the group First Liberty, which is a group that fights for religious freedom, as if we need a group that fights for religious Christian freedom when there are things like this happening. But anyways, the group First Liberty presented Kennedy's case, and it was ultimately elevated to the Supreme Court. And the court, of course, sadly, ruled in Kennedy's favor. The decision was based on the fact that Kennedy's prayer was supposedly private, even though it was on the middle of the football field, or the sidelines, I'm sorry, maybe not the middle, but it was on the football field. But it was private because he did not ask his students to join in. They did so voluntarily. Again, he still did it in front of people. And they also ruled that it was constitutional because the prayer did not include a government-created or government-funded message. And one of the arguments was that if they had prohibited such actions, it would be the same as prohibiting a Christian from wearing a cross necklace, or it would be like firing a Muslim teacher for wearing a headscarf. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit later about why those comparisons are ridiculous, but that was their argument. That was why the ultimate decision was in favor of Coach Kennedy, and they ultimately deemed the act constitutional. And again, in this decision, in deciding that this act was constitutional, they removed the Lemon Test. This is a court case that removed the Lemon Test, okay? And decided that we should be looking at the Establishment Clause and actions that potentially violate the Establishment Clause in a historical light, okay? So after the 2022 case was decided, the Department of Education updated their policies. And it says, although the Constitution forbids public school officials acting in their official capacities from directing or favoring prayer, students and teachers do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gates. I would argue that teachers do shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech when they enter the school. The Department of Education also outlines specific student rights. It says that nothing in the Constitution prohibits any public school student from voluntarily praying at any time before, during, or after the school day, and therefore students may pray with fellow students during the school day on the same terms and conditions that they may engage in other comparable conversations or activities. Students may also speak to and attempt to persuade their peers about religious matters, just as they may do with regard to, for example, political matters. Understandable. As long as students don't interrupt the education, the school day, they are free to talk about what they want. They can talk to their peers about religion, politics, video games, I don't know, whatever they want, because they're students. And ultimately, as long as they're not using school funding to promote those ideas and opinions, that's fine. They're free to do so. Now, what seems a bit icky and perhaps even contradictory is the section for educators. Now remember, we just read a section that said educators do not shed their constitutional right to free speech at the schoolhouse door. We just read that. The Department of Education then goes on to say, when teachers, coaches, and other public school officials speak in their official capacities, they may not engage in prayer or promote religious views. More broadly, when public employees make statements pursuant to their official duties, the employees are not speaking as citizens for First Amendment purposes, and the Constitution does not insulate their communications from employer discipline. That goes directly against what it said in the first section that said that students and teachers do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech. Well, the language is a little bit different. It clearly says that when they are doing their official duties as a teacher, as a coach, as an educator, their speech is not protected by the First Amendment, right? And they are subject to discipline from the school. Again, so why did the court go with Coach Kennedy? I don't know. But anyways, you can see how this is contradictory, right? It first says that teachers don't shed their constitutional rights, and then says, well, when they're operating in their official duties, we can't protect their First Amendment rights. Crazy. Now, the Department of Education immediately goes on to say that in contexts where a school permits teachers, coaches, and other employees to engage in personal speech, however, it may not prohibit those employees from engaging in prayer merely because it is religious or because some observers, including students, might misperceive the school as endorsing that expression. That said, a school may take reasonable measures to ensure that teachers, coaches, and other school officials do not pressure or encourage students to join in the private prayer of those officials or other students. Now, I have a few questions about this. First, in what context can an educator engage in personal speech? Because that's not clarified here. So that was a question that I had. What context are we talking about? Now, what I immediately imagined was, let's say a teacher is in their classroom in a free period doing lesson planning, or before school starts, they're in their classroom alone, and I don't know, maybe they pull out their Bible to do some Bible reading, or they pray over the students, they pray over their day, they pray over the chairs, whatever. That would be the teacher acting in their freedom of speech and religious expression, but not while they're doing their actual teacher duties. That would make sense. And perhaps maybe a student might walk by the door, peek in the window, see what's happening. That's all, honestly, the only thing that I can imagine of how and when this could possibly be okay, right? I can't think of another context where an educator would be allowed to speak about their religious beliefs and personal beliefs when around students, because the moment they're around students, they're operating in their official capacities as educators, right? So my second question would be, why is there a clause about being observed by students? Because this shouldn't be happening when students are around. Like I said, if a student's passing by the door and peers through the window, I mean, that's a little bit inevitable, but a teacher shouldn't be doing this with students, knowing students are around, right? And then there's also the clause about students being pressured to join in. So why does it have to say that? Why would students even potentially feel pressured to join in? Again, when an educator is with a student, they're acting in their official capacities, are they not? Do you see how this is so contradictory? I don't understand. If they're not allowed to talk about their religion and their personal views in front of students, why do we have clauses saying, well, if it does happen, then it's okay as long as students aren't pressured in, or as long as they don't think that the school endorsed it or something. It just feels like we're jumping through a million hoops to talk about a situation that shouldn't even happen in the first place, right? So with all these questions that I had, I went to the NEA, and it explains a bit more succinctly how teachers are limited in their First Amendment rights when they are at school and working as educators. And it says that employers, aka schools, can control and limit what educators say as part of their official duties. And these official duties include teaching a class, holding a parent-teacher conference, driving a school bus, and wait for it, coaching a team like Coach Kennedy. The NEA also says that free speech may be protected when teachers are on the clock but not doing those official duties. So, for example, planning time between class breaks, exactly what I was imagining, that, oh, well, maybe teachers could pray during their planning period or before school. The NEA clarifies that and says that, yes, that is okay. Now, explain this to me. Coach Kennedy was hired to do what exactly? Coach Kennedy was hired to coach a team. Now, I am not into sports. I don't do sports. I don't know what happens in the locker room. But from my understanding, a coach is on duty before the game, during the game, and after the game. Because before the game, you got to get the team ready, give them a pep talk. And then during the game, obviously coaching. And then after the game, you got to go back into the locker room, talk about what happened, what you guys did well, what you need to work on, upcoming games, practices. I don't know. But the coach is on duty before, during, and after. Are they not? Then anytime during that pre, during, and post-game period, Coach Kennedy is acting in his official duties. And as the Department of Education clearly states, and as the NEA clearly states, he cannot show any religious expression when operating in his official duties as an educator. And again, both sources said that when employees are acting in their official duties, their First Amendment free speech rights are not necessarily protected. Okay? They are not speaking as citizens for First Amendment purposes. So Coach Kennedy is not protected by the Constitution when he prays on the field right after a game. He is still operating in his official coach capacity, and he cannot be doing that religious expression. So my major question is, how the fuck did the Supreme Court rule in his favor? I don't understand this. I really don't. Again, pushing it. I guess one could say, well, it was post game. He wasn't in his official duties, but he was still on the clock. I mean, you still have students there. They're still in uniform. It's not, oh, shoot, I thought everyone was already home. I was praying in the locker room. Oh, so sorry you had to see this. No, it was literally on the field. I do not understand how they could have decided that this was constitutional. Even the Department of Education, which was edited after the Supreme Court decision, clearly states that when teachers and educators are operating in their official duties, their First Amendment rights are not necessarily protected. But then why did the Supreme Court rule in his favor? I don't understand. Now, apparently, they decided in Coach Kennedy's favor because they said that he was not coercing or manipulating students. Now, I have to disagree. As I have just explained, he shouldn't have been allowed to do this in the first place. It is clearly unconstitutional. He was operating in his official capacities, and he should not be able to do that. And secondly, I would argue that actually Coach Kennedy was coercing and manipulating students. Now, there are two main reasons why. The first one is that Christianity calls its followers to impact other people. Okay? Great Commission, go and make disciples. Christianity encourages people to talk about their faith. And as an ex-Christian, I can 100% say that I purposefully did things so that people would see me in a certain way. I purposefully did things so that people would say, oh my gosh, you're a Christian. I wanted people to see me pray, to see me do Christian things. I specifically wanted to impact those around me. It wasn't something that I wanted to do alone. Like I felt called by God to impact those around me, manipulate those around me, in other words. That is a core part of Christianity. Evangelize, go and make disciples. You are called to impact other people. And I'm not going to speak for all Christian educators because I know that there are some amazing Christian educators out there. But I was a Christian educator at one point, and I went to school with several potential rising Christian educators. And what I saw and what I did personally was, looking back on it now, outrageous. During my education, I went for a time to a Christian college, and we talked a lot about how to share Christ and spread the gospel in school in a legal way. It was essentially a discussion about pushing the limits. When do we where's the line? How do we push our religious beliefs without crossing that line, or without people knowing that we crossed the line? This was a common discussion that we had. And at that point, I was questioning a lot of things in my personal beliefs, and that honestly opened my eyes to a lot of things in Christianity in general, but that's a whole nother topic. But the issue still is that many Christian educators want their students to see Christ through them. They want to impact their students in a religious manner. They are not just there to talk about math, science, reading, or football. They are there because they feel a calling from God and to touch the hearts of their students. Again, I am speaking in general. I'm sure there's some Christian educators out there that understand the limit when it comes to public education, but even I, as an educator, I pushed those limits and I crossed them, unfortunately. And I felt that it was okay because God's call on my life was more important than a human-made law. That was something that I was taught for years, and something that I also supported for years, that our ultimate judge was God. And any human law that goes against what God's law and what God calls us to do, we can ignore. So I can clearly see how Coach Kennedy is trying to maybe not openly coerce, maybe not openly manipulate, but he is trying to impact his students. He is trying to get them to believe a certain thing without maybe directly saying, you need to believe in God. But his actions, he's using his actions to influence them. And I would say that is coercion. So why else was this coercion? 2 words for you: peer pressure. Okay. Coach Kennedy was doing this, praying on the field, giving religious motivational speeches for 7 years. 7 years, people. I don't know how somebody didn't come forward and say, hey, this isn't okay sooner. But I mean, that's besides the point. 7 years. This was already the norm. People knew that joining Coach Kennedy on the team would probably include some prayers, some Christian-ish things. And of course, students were already used to doing this. Why would they speak up? This was normal for them. This was okay. And those who are already used to doing this with the coach would, of course, want to continue doing it with him. Just because he's not saying, hey, guys, let's go pray together. They're probably still used to, okay, it's after a game, Coach Kennedy's praying, we're going to go with him. Even though he's not forcing them to go pray with him, even though he's not saying, oh, I'm not going to put you in the game if you don't go pray with me, even though it's not that blatant, it's still happening. This is still something that the kids have been used to, and this is their coach. They want to be with their coach. This is a team. Remember, this is a sports team. Sports teams are meant to develop teamwork, solidarity. You act as one unit. You stick up for each other. You do things together as a team. So if the coach is praying, what are the kids going to do? They see their example. They see their coach. They see their leader and say, we've been doing this before. Screw the school. We're going to do this together. We're a team. We stand up for this. This is what Coach Kennedy is essentially implementing into the kids' minds. Okay. And let's just imagine something. Okay. I'm going to show you guys a picture. This is Coach Kennedy. Do you see how many people and players on the field? Do you see that? Now tell me this isn't peer pressure. How would you feel as a teen if you didn't believe in God and you saw all of your teammates go onto the field, go pray, and you felt like this was maybe something ridiculous, something stupid, but would you want to be left out? Would you want to be ostracized? No, you would want to go and join in on your team. And I don't know what has happened, but let's just say that if somebody did try and say, oh, I don't want to pray, we don't know whether the teammates ridiculed them, ostracized them as kind of punishment for doing that. We don't know the team dynamics. That could have honestly happened, understanding high school dynamics. That could have happened. So essentially what Coach Kennedy here is doing is not directly using peer pressure because he's not a peer, but he is creating an environment for peer pressure to develop. And he is setting an example for other kids of the same religion to follow, and therefore pressuring those students who might not believe in that to join in because they are a team. And that's what teammates do. They stick together. Now, understandably, a lot of people might not recognize this as coercion because Christianity is the major religion in this country. And while the number of Christians in the U.S. has significantly decreased in the past couple of decades, it's still the main religion for over 2/3 of the population. So I understand. It's hard to recognize something as coercion when people are so used to it, when people are so used to hearing it. It's like, oh, it's just prayer. It's whatever. It's not doing any harm. It is. It's doing a lot of harm. But essentially praying on a football field, especially when a lot of Christians pray about games, and there's a strange connection between sports and faith that I personally never understood, but it's there for a lot of people. So when people see a Christian praying on the field for a sports team that doesn't go against public morals, that's not hurting anybody, that's okay because this is something we're used to. That doesn't make it okay. That doesn't make it constitutional, you guys. But looking at it in that light, I think it makes it easier to understand why it took 7 freaking years for somebody to finally bring this forward and suspend Coach Kennedy for what he was doing. Now, moving on to the judges on this case, unfortunately, I feel that the judges have fallen into the same kind of viewpoint that Christianity is the norm, so it's okay. And I feel like they are acting with blinders on. They are not seeing the big picture here. They're not considering people outside of their own little circle and religious opinion. Of course, there are 9 judges on the Supreme Court, so they voted 6-3 in favor of Kennedy. The 6 favorable votes were from conservative judges. I think this comes as no surprise to us. But, I mean, it's still unfortunate. So, the judge who offered the overall summary was Justice Neil M. Gorsuch. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Who was nominated by President Trump in 2017. Now, interestingly, his bio on oyez.org has a quote from him about religious freedom. And I'm going to read that to you because it's pretty ironic. So he says, talking about Justice Gorsuch, he also gained a reputation for broadly defining and then protecting religious liberties, writing that the law doesn't just apply to protect popular religious beliefs. It does perhaps its most important work in protecting unpopular religious beliefs, vindicating this nation's long-held aspiration to serve as a refuge of religious tolerance. Now, he might have said that, but did he act on that in this 2002 court case? Absolutely not. He 100% sided with the popular religious belief. Okay. If this quote is truly how he feels, I struggle to understand why he voted this way. And I mean, if he actually believed this, he would understand how isolating public prayer for a majority religion can be for those from a minority religion. So this judge literally protected the beliefs of the majority religious group in a scenario that should not even have had religious expression to begin with. So this quote from him is just, I don't know. I find it ironic. I don't know if he said that just to sound nice or if he's had a change of heart. I don't know. It's just speculation. And I also have to come back to this point that I mentioned before about the defense and some of the judges saying that denying Coach Kennedy this right to pray on the field would be akin to denying a Muslim from wearing a headscarf or a Christian from wearing a cross necklace. And for that argument to come from this justice, who is someone who supposedly protects religious liberties, is, again, completely ironic, because someone that understands that would understand that these analogies don't line up. Wearing a headscarf, or to put it in more Judeo-Christian terms, okay, a cross necklace or a Star of David is not the same as praying in front of students. Simple as that. Perhaps a more appropriate comparison to a Christian prayer on a field would be allowing Muslim teachers to perform salat in front of students. And let me just say that if that happened, there would be so much uproar from parents that that teacher would probably get fired immediately. But an interesting point is that, again, I am speaking very generally, but we generally don't see people of the Muslim faith praying in public. Who do we see praying in public? Christians. Why? Because Christianity encourages people to influence and impact and change other people. Many people from many other religions don't. So, do you see the issue here? Again, it is very subtle, but it is there. It is coercion and manipulation. Okay. And the argument that praying in front of students is akin to praying for, let's say, a meal is, again, incorrect, because teachers are not allowed to pray for meals in front of students. Okay. We already looked at the documentation from the Department of Education and the NEA. Teachers are allowed the religious expression when not operating in their official educator capacities. If they are eating with students, that means they're either on lunch duty or they're meeting with a student to go over some class material or whatever. It means they are with students. Therefore, they are operating in their official capacities. Okay, so you can't pray over a meal. I mean, if you do it in your head without any outward showing of prayer, that's fine. Can't control your thoughts. But if you physically show a form of religious expression, that's not okay. It's not okay to do that in front of students, period. Now, of course, all that to say that Judge Gorsuch and all the other 5 judges that voted in favor of Coach Kennedy are misinformed, which is very sad to say because they are Supreme Court judges. I don't know. Maybe it's not sad. It's a bit terrifying to know that these people are interpreting the law for us. So now, all that said, I do want to point out that one judge, Sonia Sotomayor, Again, my apologies for mispronouncing any names. She did write a very eloquent dissent that I would like to share with you guys because I think it offers a slight beacon of hope in this disaster of a case. And I think she puts it more eloquently than I could ever. So she says, today the court once again weakens the backstop. It elevates one individual's interest in personal religious exercise in the exact time and place of that individual's choosing over society's interest in protecting the separation between church and state, eroding the protections for religious liberty for all. Today's decision is particularly misguided because it elevates the religious rights of a school official who voluntarily accepted public employment and the limits that public employment entails over those of his students who are required to attend school and who this court has long recognized are particularly vulnerable and deserving of protection. In doing so, the court sets us further down a perilous path in forcing states to entangle themselves with religion, with all of our rights hanging in the balance. As much as the court protests otherwise, today's decision is no victory for religious liberty. I respectfully dissent, and I agree. It was beautifully said. Couldn't have put it better myself. Now, this court case with Coach Kennedy happened in 2022. And like I said, this court case removed the lemon test. It has set us up for the horrible legislation that is ongoing now. But even before the court decided on the Coach Kennedy case, there were several states pushing already to bring religion back into public school. So what is happening today in 2025 is not necessarily a direct result of the 2022 case, although it has certainly affected it and opened the path for it. But even before then, there has been a general push across the country for religion to come back in public schools. Okay. So I'm going to briefly go over a few bills that were proposed in the years leading up to the Coach Kennedy case. The first of those being a Georgia bill in 2021. It is Bill 547, and it proposed that each public school classroom teacher would conduct a brief period of quiet reflection for up to 60 seconds that is not intended for religious service or exercise, but does allow students to stand up and lead the class in a pre-written Christian prayer. Oh, gosh. Okay. I'm laughing because this is just so utterly ridiculous. Yeah. Sad and ridiculous. Do we laugh or do we cry? But so this bill stated that students would not, of course, be obligated to participate, but it would still give them the space and opportunity for all students to be subject to this prayer. So whether they participated or not, they still had to be present, which is disgusting to me. It's basically forcing them to hear religious material. It's gross. Now, I guess the supporters of this bill believe that it was constitutional because the students would lead prayer if desired. Remember that students are free to express themselves in school. However, this is a prayer in front of all of the other students. This is not a one-on-one discussion. This is not a debate. It is a teacher giving space to students. So it's not teacher-led, but it is teacher-guided or overseen by teacher. Okay, this is not a normal conversation between two students. This is a space to allow for prayer if decided. And on top of that, the prayer that would have been approved if this bill had passed was a Christian prayer that specifically identifies Jesus Christ, which of course makes it a clear religious affiliation to the Christian faith. Now, obviously, giving the space for prayer in a public school classroom seems to directly go against the court case Engel versus Vattel. So I don't know how this was even drafted, but the Engel versus Vattel case, if you remember, prohibited a non-religious affiliated prayer. So this bill promoted a clearly religious affiliated prayer. So I would have to say that this is even doubly unconstitutional. There's one, giving a space for prayer, classroom-wide prayer, and two, it is a clearly religious affiliated prayer that would be allowed. So even if students can opt out, where are they going to go? You're going to send them out to the hall? Like, that's ridiculous. Or you want them to put headphones in so they don't hear the prayer? That's so stupid. Stupid and unconstitutional, guys. Also in 2001, we have Texas Bill 2399. which proposed that public and charter schools not affiliated with a religious organization may vote to include a period of daily prayer and Bible readings. Similar to the Georgia bill, it is supposedly voluntary. Students and teachers who want to participate in this time would have to sign forms acknowledging that this is a free choice, that they have no objections, and that they waive any constitutional claims against the school regarding the Establishment Clause. What? I feel like that is an open admission that this bill goes against the Constitution, saying, okay, we're going to put this in and everybody has to sign a form that they can't use the Establishment Clause against us because we secretly know that this goes against it. It's ridiculous. Now, the bill specifically said that the prayer wouldn't be done over a loudspeaker, of course, to accommodate the Santa Fe versus Doe court case that we saw, since that would be obviously using government funds to support the prayer. And the bill also goes on to say that the sessions would only occur in situations where those who have signed the forms could attend. So that would include situations like before school, maybe in a teacher's classroom with submitted consent forms, or anywhere at all in the school if all teachers and students sign the forms. Guys, this is in public schools. I can't believe this. Now, I see this bill trying to address all potential objections, what with the forms and organizing in areas where non-Christians won't get offended. But where's the bill proposing that we read the Quran in classes? That doesn't exist. What about the bill, I don't know, exploring natural humanism or the Satanic Temple tenets or Hinduism? Where are all the bills supporting that? If they don't exist, it's only Christianity, guys. What the actual fuck? I can't believe this. Let's move on to Mississippi. So in 2028, the state actually established a law that public schools can have that 60-second quiet period that we talked about for Georgia. And it's a reflection period, okay? It's not a prayer period, it's a reflection period. Now, I guess that technically works around the Engel versus Vattel decision, since it's not a prayer, just reflection. But we all know that some of the people enacting it will use it as a time of prayer. Let's be real. Okay? Bible Belt. If people are promoting this law, they are doing it for a reason, because they want Christianity in schools. So who's stopping a teacher from saying, instead of, oh, this is a period of reflection, oh, this is a period of reflection and prayer? Or even going further than that. Like I said, a lot of people that I interacted with who are Christians and educators wanted to push those limits, and this law allows for them to push and even cross those limits. Okay, this is why I am so upset about what is going on. Okay, so Mississippi passed that law in 2018. Then in 2022, they proposed Bill 249 that would have actually included the opportunity for prayer had it been passed, just like the aforementioned Georgia bill. However, it wasn't passed. But it specifically stated that students can lead a non-sectarian, non-proselytizing prayer in silence or out loud. That is towing a very dangerous line. Actually, no, that line has been crossed. And this is just a slow transition into just straight up putting religion back into public schools, which is what is on the table today. Moving on to Kentucky. Now, the state already has a law stating that public school students can recite the Lord's Prayer, which is, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, etc. And the Pledge of Allegiance. Oh, but don't worry. Okay, don't worry. Students can choose whether to participate. That makes it all better, right? But does this sound familiar? I mean, if we think back to the court cases that we talked about, Abington Township versus Shemp, remember that ruling that decided that recitation of the Lord's Prayer and Bible reading was unconstitutional? Remember that? No? Apparently in Kentucky, they don't remember it either. So, And in this Kentucky bill, even if the students opt out, the teachers will still tell them that the Lord's Prayer is history. Okay, it's what the Pilgrim Fathers recited when they came to this country in search of freedom. I don't know. I just think that's so ironic, right? So many people settled into this country seeking religious freedom. And what are governments and schools doing? They're limiting religious freedoms by reciting a Christian prayer. I mean, we're just cycling backwards, guys. I don't care if they say it's not a religious lesson. It is. If they were purely focusing on history, they would also, I don't know, share prayers from other groups that were in the country at that time. Maybe Native prayers, maybe prayers from people groups that came later on in the history of this country. Crazy. And also teaching the Lord's Prayer to these kids is just disgusting to me. These kids are young and impressionable, and it's just gross to have them recite the Lord's Prayer. And they're probably not going home to their parents and saying, Mom, Dad, we recited the Lord's Prayer. And I assume that a lot of parents don't know that this is happening. And would they feel comfortable with that? I don't know. It feels a lot like indoctrination. Like this is something that you would expect if you go to Sunday school. And that's why people take their kids to Sunday school, to have this, not public education. This shouldn't be happening in public schools. Now, another part of the law, we're still in Kentucky, states that a public school can enact a 60-second moment of silence. Now, in 2022, a bill proposed changing that, making the moment of silence or reflection mandatory and increasing it to 1 to 2 minutes. Not a lot, but still. I mean, when you're sitting there in silence or listening to prayer, it can feel like an eternity. The bill also added a whole section about how it will be a voluntary act and not affiliated with any religion. But again, let's be real here. The students are already potentially reciting the Lord's Prayer, and many of the teachers may be religious. Consider the area, the state. It's Kentucky. It's very possible that the teachers are religious. So it is not a stretch of the imagination to think that a Christian teacher might take that moment of silence, moment of supposed reflection, and bow their head in prayer because they're already doing the Lord's Prayer in class. So what are the students potentially seeing? A form of religious expression in the public classroom. This is just pushing things way too far. All right, we have one more case before we go into the state-by-state legislation. And this one happened in 2022. Before the Supreme Court made their final decision, they were still debating it when this was written. So this bill is actually titled Coach Kennedy's Law. So it's so crazy to me. I'm sorry, it's completely outrageous. But this bill stated that the athletic department staff were fully within their constitutional rights to utter prayers out loud before, during, or after student athletic events. This is absolutely insane to me because it goes directly against what is clearly laid out by the Department of Education as what is appropriate religious expression. We went over this, remember? Teachers have religious freedoms when they're not operating in their official capacities as educators. And that includes sports staff, coaches. Athletic staff are required to work with students before, during, and after sports events. So how can this supposed Coach Kennedy's law actually state that it is within the coach's constitutional rights to do religious activities during those times? I don't understand. I don't understand at all. Now, there's a clause in this bill saying that students, again, have the right to opt out because you always have to state that it's voluntary. But I have to come back to the point that whether or not you say it's voluntary doesn't really matter if a educator or somebody in a leadership position in a school is doing this in front of the students, because it is coercion and manipulation. And I already explained why. It's not okay. You can't expect a student to say, oh, I opt out and everything be okay. That's not how this works. And another point is that students have a constitutional right to express their viewpoints in school and also not to be subjected to watch and hear their teacher's personal religious views. They have a right not to hear it. They shouldn't even have to opt out, especially not in sports events when camaraderie is so critical. Equality and true separation of church and state would give everyone the chance to opt in if they wanted to, not force a certain percentage of the people to opt out when they don't want to hear something. That's not true equality. That's not separation of church and state. That's some fancy, not even fancy language. That's just something they added in to make it seem like it's constitutional. But guys, it's not. It's absolutely not. Now, the somewhat good news about all of these cases is that most of them were not passed. However, as I mentioned, some states already have some laws established that have opened the door to bringing religion back into public education. And I mean, call it what you want, a history lesson, a moment of silence, a moment of reflection, whatever. That's not what it is. This is bringing religion into school. This is welcoming Christianity back into public schools. And it's not okay. It's not constitutional. I don't care what name you give it. And guess what? There are even more religious bills being proposed, being written, and even signed into law that are welcoming Christianity back into public schools. And both the Coach Kennedy case and the recent election results have seemed to push even more conservative Christian legislator into creation. And that leads us to our state-by-state adventure of discovering all the different horrible, crazy legislation that is, again, combining religion and public education. Now, the first state that we have to talk about is West Virginia. In 2024, so that was just last year, West Virginia passed the Intelligent Design Bill. It is a very short amendment to the law stating that a public school teacher essentially can't be limited on what they talk about regarding the origin of the universe. It simply says, and I quote, "No public school board, school superintendent, or school principal shall prohibit a public school classroom teacher from discussing or answering questions from students about scientific theories of how the universe and or life came to exist." Now, when I first read this, I didn't see a problem with this. Technically, intelligent design, as the bill is called Intelligent Design Bill, technically intelligent design isn't a scientific theory. Okay? And the law specifically says that you can't inhibit a teacher from discussing questions about scientific theories, about the origin of the universe. So intelligent design isn't a scientific theory. So I don't see the problem with this or how it's connected to intelligent design. Okay. And to clarify, intelligent design isn't a theory. It is an untestable claim. Okay. I claim that an intelligent designer created or had a hand in creating the universe. And this is an untestable claim because we don't have some intelligent designer or some deity that we can just say, hey, we need to do an experiment. Let's test this. Let's test this theory. It's a claim and we can't test it. So it is therefore an untestable claim. It is not a scientific theory. It is not backed by evidence. It is not backed by observations and experiments that people have carried out. Okay, it is by definition not a scientific theory. So this bill, which does not prohibit a teacher from talking about scientific theories about the origin of the universe, does nothing essentially. I mean, legally, it does nothing. It says you can talk about different scientific theories, and intelligent design isn't one of them. However, the law is dubbed the Intelligent Design Law. Why? Because of the intent behind it. Okay, it was intended as a way to open up in-class conversation about intelligent design. And might I add, there's a whole other case that we didn't talk about that happened in 2005. It was a federal ruling on the case Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District, and it found that teaching about intelligent design as an alternative to evolution was unconstitutional as it expresses a Christian viewpoint. So that's a nice little tidbit of information that perhaps supports the idea that this bill is unconstitutional in its intent. In its language, it's not unconstitutional because it does nothing. But in its intent to open up the conversation about intelligent design, it could potentially be unconstitutional. And this so-called Intelligent Design Bill, as I said, it was passed. It was made into law. While the intent behind it is clearly unconstitutional, the bill itself does virtually nothing. The issue, though, is that teachers who are potentially aware of this bill may use it as an excuse to promote intelligent design because they believe it is an actual scientific theory. And I say that because I sure as hell would have as a Christian. I would have been, oh my gosh, we can talk about intelligent design. I'm going to share this with my students. This is so amazing. I'm going to add this into the lesson. I totally would have done it. Totally, 100%. I would have been over the moon to hear that we could talk about intelligent design in the classroom. And unfortunately, that seems to be just what is happening, because guess what? The bill's sponsor is Senator Amy Grady, who is also a public school teacher. Yay! She has said, and I quote, "I've had teachers reach out to me in support of this bill because they felt that in their science classes that they cannot answer questions from students." Now, I have some more questions about this. What questions from students can't teachers answer? And also, why can't they answer them? How hard is it to provide a simple explication? How hard is it to provide a simple explanation like, I don't know. Well, we can't know for certain about the origin of the universe because nobody was there. However, one theory, like the Big Bang Theory, is backed by extensive scientific research. Some people believe in things like intelligent design, but scientifically, that is not a theory because it is an untestable claim. And then you could go into the difference between a theory and a claim. See what I did there? I acknowledged a system of belief. I acknowledged an idea that perhaps a student might have asked about. I acknowledged it. It exists. People believe in it. I explained why we're not going to discuss it. And then I redirected into a discussion about a theory versus claim. Is it really that hard to do? Is it really that hard as a teacher to redirect the conversation away from something that maybe a teacher shouldn't be talking about? Or something that, I don't know, might cross some lines? Is it really that hard to redirect? What are they doing when students ask them about their political affiliations? Are they explaining, are they giving like a 5-minute thesis on why they voted a certain way? Teachers are supposed to be able to redirect. And if they're not, I have to question their teaching abilities. And if the issue isn't that they aren't capable of redirecting, then I have to assume that the issue is that they don't want to redirect. And that's a bigger issue, because then teachers are specifically looking for opportunities to share their own personal views. Okay. And when they could clearly redirect. Guys, it's not that hard. And because it's not that hard, I think that they don't want to redirect. They want an excuse to talk about this. And even if they don't openly admit it, I speak as an ex-Christian educator. I would have subconsciously or potentially consciously wanted an excuse to talk about it. Okay. I could have used the excuse, well, I can't just openly ignore their questions. I can't do this, when honestly I could have easily redirected. And that is how I would have reacted as a Christian educator. Now, this bill, which has turned into a law, also received some support from students because they said that their teachers fear for their careers if they inform students about intelligent design. And again, I have to wonder how this topic keeps coming up. I have to wonder. Scientifically, and I repeat, scientifically, intelligent design is not a theory. It is not in science books, at least the books that should be used in public schools. So it has to be either persistent questions from the students or a hidden motive from the teachers who want to share their ideas and opinions and thoughts about intelligent design. If it is the former, then my explication, oh my gosh. If it is the former, then my explanation about theory versus claim would be simple and easy to use. And that's a great scientific, non-religious, non-affiliated way to answer. You're acknowledging something and moving on. And if it is the latter, aka teachers who want to promote a specific idea, then again, like I said, we have some major problems. Now, when this bill was passed, it was passed alongside another sketchy bill, which, to be honest, it's not unconstitutional. In other words, it is constitutional. Sorry for my double negative there. But it is interesting. Okay, so this bill was passed alongside Bill 152 that states that all schools must display in an obvious space in the classroom a poster with the motto, "In God We Trust." Okay. And I'm going to get into why putting posters in school with this stuff is just ridiculous in another state conversation. But again, technically this bill is constitutional because the national motto is "In God We Trust." Okay. It shouldn't be the country's motto, but again, that's a conversation for another day. But I go back to the interesting thing. These two bills were passed together. Okay. One bill about the poster with "In God We Trust" and the other bill dubbed the Intelligent Design Bill. Okay. Both were passed together. Interestingly, both of these bills were presented the year before they were passed and they were rejected. Okay. Both of them failed to pass. The second time around, they were passed into law. Could this speak toward a shift toward religion being more accepted in public schools? Yes, I would say absolutely. All right, our next state is Texas, and we have two problematic bills presented in the Senate in February 2025. And surprise, surprise, they are sponsored by all 20 Republicans in the Texas Senate. Now, why does that matter? Because Republicans hold an almost 65% majority in the Texas Senate and almost 59% majority in the House. So, if Republicans unanimously support these bills, then it's very probably that they will pass just due to simple majority vote. So while the aforementioned 2021 bill about prayer and Bible reading in public schools didn't pass, these bills probably will, especially in light of the recent election. I just looked into this 5 minutes ago, and between the time that I wrote the script and I'm filming, both of these bills passed the Senate. Okay, so they are 50% of the way to becoming law. After the Senate, they have to move to the House. Like I said, it was very probable that they would pass due to a simple majority. And actually, I'm going to look into how many voted. Let's see. So for one bill, we had read for the third time voted 23 people said yes, no 7, and there was 1 absent. And then for the other bill, now this one had a bigger no vote. So it was only 20 yeses and 11 no's. But I mean, both of them passed the Senate. So craziness, guys. Craziness. These are halfway there to becoming law. And if they already passed the Senate, I mean, like I said, there's a majority in the House as well. So it's very likely that these will become law. So what are they? We've talked about all this, but we haven't talked about what they are. So for the first one, Senate Bill 11, it is essentially a resurrection of the rejected 2021 bill that I said had to do with prayer and Bible reading. Sadly, it is back and it has come back with a vengeance. Now, specifically, this bill calls for a period of prayer and Bible reading. Or, guys, don't freak out yet. Or it could be a reading of another religious text. Whew, phew. Not really. The bill also states that there are the same requirements for permission slips and signing away any right to object based on the Establishment Clause. So we're back to that, signing away our rights to say, hey, this isn't constitutional. The bill also would require the Bible reading and prayer to occur before school or only in classrooms where everybody has signed the permission slips. Again, that's similar to the bill that was previously rejected. It's just the same thing, different year, and this time it is being passed. Okay. The biggest change that I see between the previous bill that was not passed and the current one that is 50% of the way to being passed is the addition of the statement, other religious texts. Okay. Now, of course, while it is being done in an attempt to be inclusive, let's be honest. We're talking about Texas here. Texas is the third most religious state in the country, with the largest religious group in each county being some flavor of Christianity, usually Catholic or Southern Baptist. So given the option, what will teachers, superintendents, principals initiate? Bible readings. Even if there were a possibility for, I don't know, readings of the Quran or selections from the Satanic Temple Library, I highly doubt that, 1, many teachers would support that, and that 2, many parents would sign permission slips for their kids to go and participate. Now, the language here is very important as well because it says shall adopt a policy requiring every campus to provide a period of prayer and reading of the Bible or other religious text. Okay, first, let's talk about the word requiring. While the district or school system may vote, once that decision is made, all campuses and schools are required to partake. The second word I want to highlight here is a period. Not multiple periods for different religious groups and different religious text readings. No, one period. And it has to be at a certain time when only those with permission slips can join. And of course, not be heard by others. So we're talking about exclusivity here. Dare I say segregation by religious belief? The other phrase is Bible or other religious text. Again, the same thing here. Not and/or, just or. It is either one or the other. It is either Bible or another religious text. And again, if it's just one period for just one religious text, which text is a mostly Christian area, a mostly Christian state going to choose? The Bible, obviously. And on top of all of these glaring issues, we haven't talked about the most important problem with this. The fact that this is unconstitutional to begin with. Okay, this bill is halfway on its way to introducing religion in schools again. This is not a student-initiated club. This is not students saying, oh, I want to read the Bible with my peers after class and we don't have a space to do this. This is not it. Guys, this is the school board making these decisions for public schools, for the entire district that they're in charge of. Like, this is 100% not okay. And of course, the bill has a note about the school's loudspeaker system to comply with the Santa Fe versus Doe Supreme Court ruling that we talked about. You can't use government funds. But even authorizing staff-led religious meetings or approving required religious text readings in school is using school resources, okay? You're using the teachers, you're using the space, you're using the time. I mean, who's going to organize all this stuff? Who's going to print out the papers and send all these permission slips to parents? Or maybe it's online now, I guess. But I mean, who's taking the time to organize this, create this? This is time and resources paid by who? The government, because it's a public school. It's a fucking public school. These are government funds, guys. Ugh. And it's being used to promote a specific religion. And the addition of other religious texts is, in my opinion, just to sound inclusive, because what district would approve religious text readings that aren't from the Bible in a state like Texas? It's crazy. This is unconstitutional, 100% unconstitutional. And honestly, it needs to be addressed. All right, the second bill in Texas that is, again, halfway to being passed. It's depressing. It was also introduced in February 2025, and it is Senate Bill 10. This one says that public elementary and secondary schools shall display in a conspicuous place in each classroom a copy of the 10 Commandments. I had some hope that this bill wasn't going to pass because of all the details we're going to get into, but I can't believe it is. So the copy of the 10 Commandments that must be displayed in a conspicuous place. You can't hide it behind your desk and hope nobody sees it. It has to be in a conspicuous place. It also must be legible so that anyone in any area of the classroom can read it. It also needs to be at least 16 by 20 inches. That's, 16 by 20-ish? I don't know. And it also must present the 10 Commandments in the version listed in the bill, which I assume is a New King James Version, since it uses thou, but don't quote me on that. Now, if a classroom doesn't have a copy, it must accept a privately donated copy. This is obligatory. It must. This is insane. It may also purchase one using, guess what? School funds. What the actual fuck, guys? School funds. I thought that the Establishment Clause was being interpreted in a way that made it clear that you can't use government funds to support a certain religion or non-religion. But here we are. If you don't have a copy, you can either accept a donated copy or use school funds to pay for it. The other issue here, besides the obviously unconstitutionality of it, is that Texas school districts are already struggling with a lack of funding and struggling majorly. Okay, look at these headlines. Need I go on? I don't think so. And this bill would approve public school funds going towards a fucking 10 Commandments poster for every single classroom in the state. Insane. Now, I know a poster wouldn't cost that much, but actually, you know what? Let's look up exactly how much it would cost. Okay, I take that back. A 16 by 20 inch unframed poster can cost around $20 to $30. That's a bit more than I expected. I was thinking like $5. Here are some examples that I found. And the options are pretty limited because you have to make sure that the text is legible so that people can read it when they're standing anywhere in the room. So you have just a few options and they are a bit expensive. Now, all of these examples that I'm showing you are unframed. Just imagine how much the cost would skyrocket if you chose to pick a framed copy. Okay, now a copy in each classroom. So it's $20 to $30 for each poster. We're putting them in each classroom. Let's look up how many classrooms are in Texas. So let's Google. How many classrooms in a standard Texas public school? Okay, so AI tells me that there is an average of 39 classrooms for a middle school. So let's just go with that. And how many schools in Texas? Again, it says about 8,000. So let's do some simple math. 8,000 schools multiplied by 39 classrooms, and we get about 312,000 different classrooms in the whole state. Now multiply 312,000 by, let's be nice and say about $20, and you get $6.24 million. $6.24 million for a stupid effing poster. This bill, which again is halfway to becoming law, would approve government funding of over $6 million to go towards posters that promote Christian ideas and Christian fundamentals. Insane. And this is during a time when Texas public schools have a severe funding deficit. So I could think of about a dozen different things that we could be spending this money on instead of stupid posters. Let's say, I don't know, new materials, new laptops, STEM classes, ESL classes, free breakfast, or crazy idea, maybe paying teachers better. I know it's crazy, and I just want to point out that for many Christian educators, having Christ in any capacity in the classroom would be a priority. We are sons and daughters of the Most High King before we are anything else, before we are teachers, before we are parents, before we are just general citizens. So the laws of God always are higher and more important than the laws of humans. And one of the major commandments is to go and make disciples. So if there was a way to bring Christ in the classroom, especially a legal way, I would have been 100% for this. So if I were still a Christian teaching in Texas, I would be overjoyed at this bill. Finally, a way to bring Christ into the classroom, and on top of that, it's legal. And I would even go to the extent of using my own money and my own funds to buy posters for my classrooms and the classrooms of my fellow teachers. Like, that is how much I would have supported this as a Christian. I would be overjoyed because this would be a way that is legal, albeit unconstitutional, but that's besides the point. It would be a legal way to bring my faith into the classroom because the ultimate goal is to bring God glory, right? The ultimate goal is to show Christ in everything that we do. So what better way to have a poster of the 10 Commandments and, point it out sometimes and, hey, remember this? And I would 100% be on board with that. And speaking as an ex-Christian, I assume that there are many other educators in Texas that are also overjoyed that this is happening and would probably even go the same distance of using their own funds to purchase a poster. And of course, this bill ends with a clause saying that no public elementary or secondary school is exempt. So all schools in Texas, if this bill is passed, must include a poster of the 10 Commandments in the classroom. Insanity. Now, on top of these two bills that are on their way to becoming law, we have a very sketchy, dare I say, borderline insane curriculum that was just adopted in the state. This follows the passing of the Texas House Bill 1605 in 2023, which asked the Texas Education Agency to create state-owned textbooks. And they developed essentially what are Christian-esque textbooks, right? And I'm going to give you a brief overview of how this curriculum integrates Christianity into virtually everything. Now, I can't get into all the details, so we're just going to look at one grade level, but I am going to create a different video going into the details of how this curriculum essentially promotes Christian nationalism. So that is your friendly reminder to like and subscribe so you can catch that video when it drops. But for now, let's look at the 5th grade language arts curriculum, which as far as I can see includes some history and social studies elements. There are 10 units, and guess how many include some mention of Christianity, the Bible, or God? 8. Yep, 8 out of 10. Crazy. All right, so it all starts in Unit 2, which is supposed to cover the art and culture of the Renaissance. However, it reads more like a section devoted to explaining how Christianity drove the Renaissance. Again, this is just a quick look, but there are 32 mentions of Christian or Christianity in the teacher's guide compared to just 4 mentions of Islam, which I think that is just a slap in the face to the massive influence that Islam had on the Renaissance. Now, did religion affect the Renaissance? Absolutely, of course. But so did other factors, which is severely overlooked in this curriculum. Take a look at this page. It says, people thought a lot about the path to heaven. Not an afterlife, heaven, which is a particularly Christian idea. It goes on to say, art was created to honor God or to communicate stories from the Christian Bible, which was important because few people were able to read during this time. Now, let's ignore the poor punctuation in this section, which I think is absolutely unforgivable for a state-owned textbook, but I digress. It says, art was created to honor God. That is utterly misleading because who were the people that actually had enough money to commission these artists? The church and very wealthy, often religious people. And interestingly, they wanted to influence others to believe in God, right? So it wasn't created to honor God, but more as a way to influence others. And I assume that if other people had enough money to commission the artists, they would have also done so, perhaps creating non-religious pieces, but that wasn't the case because the church had the most money at the time. Now, of course, the communication part is spot on because people did want to communicate stories about the Bible, but this curriculum is completely jumping over the why behind it. And that why would be the power and control of the church. They wanted to expand the control and influence more people, but the curriculum doesn't touch on that. So again, this whole sentence is completely misleading. Also, what about the mythological Catholic art pieces? I mean, if we're going to talk about religion and the Renaissance, can we talk about these pieces? They're wonderfully macabre and interesting and creepy, and I love them. But if we're going to talk about religion and religion's influence on the Renaissance, why not include these? Oh wait, I forgot, it doesn't fit the picture perfect Christian narrative, so of course we're not going to include them. So overall, using a simple statement like this is not only misleading, but it is essentially a lie by omission. It overlooks so much history that it's quite frankly a bit offensive, and a lot of the curriculum is just like this. Here's another example from Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. Obviously, this is a classic depicting a story from the Bible, of course, but the curriculum goes way too in-depth into Christianity and elements from the Bible when explaining an art piece, and especially in a curriculum for a 5th grade language arts course. Again, I have to emphasize this, that it is a language arts curriculum. This isn't an art class, this isn't a religion class, this is language arts, okay? So the curriculum says, to understand the painting, we must understand the Christian Bible story. I mean, you could understand it in one sentence, really. But the curriculum goes into detail about the Passover and the importance of communion, 2 things that I think are utterly not irrelevant to the painting, because I mean, the idea of communion comes from the Last Supper. Why were they having the Last Supper? Because of the Passover. I mean, it's obviously connected, but you don't need to understand the Jewish tradition of Passover and the now Christian tradition of communion to understand this painting. Simple. And the curriculum even includes a quote from the Bible and has a note to the teacher about the Hebrew Bible and the Old and New Testaments. Again, things that you don't need to get into to look at a painting, especially when you're reading content for a language arts curriculum. I think we could have limited this section to include just a few sentences talking about how Da Vinci worked to recreate a story from the Bible about when Jesus told his disciples that one of them would eventually betray him. And then you could go on to talk about how he rendered the different faces, the different reactions, the materials he used to create it. I don't know. That's it. You can use just one sentence to explain the painting and move on. There is absolutely no need to include quotes from the Bible, an explanation of the Passover, or even vocabulary words like there are in here, like disciples and covenant. What the fuck? You don't need that, okay? You simply don't need it. It's unnecessary. Now let's look briefly at Unit 5, Poetry. I honestly almost didn't even open up this section because I thought there couldn't possibly be mention of Christianity and God in a section on poetry. But boy, was I wrong, okay? This section teaches Psalms 23. Psalms 23, and if you don't know, it is the psalm that goes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters," etc. The teacher's guide also tells teachers to review the author's biography. So, who is the author? Supposedly King David. And it tells teachers to discuss who King David was, mentioning stories like David and Goliath and King Saul. Again, going a little bit over the top and talking about Bible stories in the classroom in a section on poetry. Okay. Here are some questions and expected answers that the teacher's guide also includes. After line 1, ask students, which point of view does the psalmist use in the psalm? The answer would be the psalmist writes in the first person, he is the sheep, and the Lord is his shepherd. Explain that David is speaking to the Lord. This term can be defined as one having authority or power over another. David believes his God is Lord. So we're teaching students that God is Lord. Interesting. I mean, not directly, but we're looking at a passage and emphasizing David's beliefs. And that is subtle indoctrination, if you ask me. Okay. After line 2, the teacher's guide says to ask students, what rich and vivid language does David use to continue the metaphor from line 1? The answer is David uses words like lie down in green pastures and leadeth me beside the still waters to illustrate that the Lord provides nourishment for him. So again, here we're subtly teaching students that the Lord provides nourishment for people. Moving on, another question says, explain that a rod and staff are used to protect and guide sheep. How does this imagery show how David feels about his God? Pause for responses. Call students' attention to the imagery in line 4, Valley of the Shadow of Death. Explain to students that David is using this phrase to describe that even in the worst of times, he fears no evil because of the trust he has in his Lord. And so here we're teaching kids that you don't need to fear because you can trust in God. Again, this isn't overt, obvious teaching that kids, you have to believe this, but it is going way too far and it is implanting these ideas in public school students. Does this sound like non-biased teaching using religious elements to support a secular curriculum? No. And that's the argument that a lot of people have been saying, that it is constitutional to include mentions of Christianity if it is a non-biased teaching or if it's just in support of a secular curriculum. But does this sound non-biased to you? Absolutely not. And another question, is this what 5th graders should actually be learning in a language arts class? Again, absolutely not. This type of subtle indoctrination continues throughout the units, culminating in a novel study. And guess which novel they chose? Out of all the wonderful, incredible novels that they could have chosen for a 5th grade language arts curriculum, guess which one they chose? A biblical allegory. And of course, I'm talking about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe from the Chronicles of Narnia. Now listen, I am not against the series. I am not against novels including religious elements. I'm not against biblical allegories by any stretch of the imagination. I actually really enjoyed the Chronicles of Narnia when I read them. What I am against is teaching these books in a public school setting, especially as the one and only novel study. This isn't a part of a study on allegories. This isn't a part on a study of religious influences on novels. This is a single book used in the unit on the novel study, and it is specifically religious. That is what I'm against, okay? C.S. Lewis is great. I have nothing against his work. So I 100% believe that they chose this novel to subtly indoctrinate the students into Christianity without being too obvious. And I say that because I did the same thing as a teacher, unfortunately. When I worked as a missionary, I had several ESL classes, and I chose a book to supplement learning and introduce new vocabulary. And guess which book I chose? Not The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but it was the first book in the series, which is The Magician's Nephew. And I specifically chose it because I thought that it was a nice way to include religious topics in a way that my students would be more open to receiving. Now, The Magician's Nephew wasn't as overtly religious as The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but I chose it with a purpose, and that purpose was to open the floor to conversation about religion, to bring it into the classroom without being a horrible Bible thumper, as they call them. But I did it with a purpose. I specifically chose that book with a purpose, and that purpose was to spread Christianity. Of course, in a more acceptable way in a secular environment. So you cannot tell me that the people who created this curriculum did not do the same. I 100% believe that they specifically chose this novel to implement Christianity in public schools. Okay? I see no other reason to include it, to be honest. I mean, with so many better novels the state could have chosen for this curriculum. Other novels that are, I don't know, maybe not biblical allegories, right? But the worst part is that the state is paying the schools to incorporate this curriculum. Yes, you heard that correctly. The state of Texas is offering financial incentives to schools that include this Christian-infused curriculum. So instead of forcing this curriculum on schools and saying you must teach it, you must teach this curriculum with obvious Christian elements, the Texas Education Agency is offering financial incentives and perks for schools that choose to adapt it. Specifically, they are offering $40 per student annually, plus another $20 per student for printing costs. Why is it $40 per student annually? Don't ask me. I have no idea. But I should think that this should all be a one-time cost, right? But they are offering $40 per student each year for every school that chooses to implement this. Remember how much putting up just one poster in each classroom would cost? $6.24 million. Remember that? Okay, we are looking at a much bigger sum here. There are about 2.1 million students enrolled in K-5 classes in Texas, which is who would use this language arts curriculum. So multiply 2.1 million by the $40 annual incentive, and we have $84 million annually. Now add on top of that another $42 million for printing costs, because the $20 multiplied by 2.1 million, that's a one-time cost, $42 million for printing costs. Are you kidding me? That is over $100 million in potential incentives to include a Christian curriculum in public schools. And again, this is happening when public schools in Texas are already facing budget cuts and deficits. And because of that, I think this is honestly disgusting, because I feel like the state is taking advantage of the fact that schools need funds so badly that they're saying, okay, well, here are the funds that you need. You just have to incorporate this Christian infused curriculum. You want to buy those new textbooks? You want to buy new laptops? You want to pay your teachers a living wage? Well, just teach them this curriculum about Christianity, and you'll have your funds. You'll have $40 per student annually if you include this curriculum, right? That's disgusting. That's taking advantage of schools that are struggling to get by. It's insanity, guys. All right. Are you ready for more? I wish there wasn't more, but sadly there is. So let's move over to the state of Idaho. Remember the 1963 Supreme Court case that deemed it unconstitutional to read the Bible in public schools? Well, because of that court case decision, a similar law about reading the Bible in public schools in Idaho was struck down. However, after the 2022 Coach Kennedy case, that law about reading the Bible has resurfaced. And it is now the Idaho Bill 162. If you remember, the Supreme Court decided with the Coach Kennedy case that decisions about the Establishment Clause had to be made with a historical perspective. And that's exactly what Idaho legislators are really digging into with this new bill. It was presented in February 2025, and it starts off with some interesting points. Let's take a look. It says, the Bible is the most important book in the world, molds public morality, impacts history, and contains unequaled literary value. Wow, that's a lot of claims. First, importance is subjective. So the claim that the Bible is the most important book can't be proven. Also, saying that it is the most important book in the world is simply hyperbolous. You can't tell me that it's the most important book in East Asia or the Middle East. That's just simply not true. Heck, a lot of people here in the United States would not agree with that, like me. Moving on to molds public morality. Now, this is an interesting point that I don't want to get into too much detail in this video because it's quite complex and I think it deserves a whole video of its own. But I do want to point out that a lot of the moral ideas in the Bible, especially those expressed by Jesus, were not new ideas. Take the Golden Rule, for example. That was established well before Jesus, but a lot of people contributed to the Bible and Christianity because it's a popular book, but it wasn't created by Jesus. So that idea of the Golden Rule, do unto others as you would have them do to you, that molds morality, right? But that isn't necessarily from the Bible. It is in the Bible, yes, but the Bible didn't invent it. Jesus didn't invent it. So I could argue that it isn't actually the Bible impacting public morality in that point, but philosophers and religions before Jesus. So this whole idea of the Bible molding public morality, has the Bible impacted morality? Yes, but I don't think it has to the extent that people really believe it has. Moving on to the phrase impact history. I mean, yes, obviously the Bible has impacted history. The question is for better or for worse, right? And finally, the phrase unequaled literary value. I mean, this is also extremely subjective, right? I know a lot of people who would value a dozen other books well before the Bible. Even historians who value biblical texts would also value non-biblical texts equally, right? The Bible, just because it's the Bible, it doesn't have more literary value than others. And so this phrase unequal literary value is just insane to me. Now, the next section in the introduction of this Idaho bill explains the importance and the impact of specifically the King James Version of the Bible. Now, I think that's very interesting because you would assume that the King James Version is the first English version, and that's why it's so important, right? But it wasn't actually the first English translation. The reason that the King James Version became so popular was because of King James. King James of England wanted to make a version of his own of the Bible. Okay, so he commissioned a superior version to be made, and that was what he supported and dispersed. And so that was what became popular. So in fact, from the beginning, it wasn't necessarily the King James Version of the Bible that had such an impact. It was the ruling party behind it. It was the monarchy supporting and implementing it and saying that this is the superior version. And what's interesting to me is that the original settlers of the United States, many of them at least, came to this country to escape the religious government and to escape such tyranny that implemented a specific version of Christianity, and they sought religious freedom. And now their ancestors, people today, are returning to that. And I think it's just very ironic that we are going back in the past. We are backpedaling yet again. Now, the next two sections of this Idaho bill explains the importance of the Bible for early Americans. And I just have to say, so what? Who cares? That was, 250 years ago? I don't really care if early Americans thought the Bible was important. The society is completely different today. So I don't really know. But since the Supreme Court in 2022 with the Coach Kennedy case decided that we're looking at everything with a historical perspective, it's now important again what the original Americans thought, which is just ridiculous to me. But this is the argument that legislators are using, and it is very clear in this specific bill in Idaho. From there, we have a list of Supreme Court cases, many of which we have discussed in this video. Point 13 then specifically calls out the shift in the Establishment Clause jurisprudence, or in simple terms, the philosophy of how we interpret the Establishment Clause. And this again refers to the result of the Coach Kennedy case, how we are now supposedly using a historical lens to determine what violates the Establishment Clause and what doesn't. So legislators in this act are arguing that decisions on cases like Abington versus Schempp are no longer valid. And so that makes Bible reading constitutional, because we're now interpreting the Constitution with a historical lens. And since the original Americans and the original settlers read the Bible in schools, well, so should we today. That's the argument they're going with. And obviously I have so many issues with this, right? My main issue is that the Supreme Court should not use a historical lens to interpret the Constitution. The United States is nothing like it was when it was founded. Again, that was about 250 years ago. And so we cannot use societal norms from 250 years ago to define our societal norms today. Simple as that. We have made amendments to the Constitution for a reason. Things change. Views change. Amendments have been added to give more rights to people. Why are we now looking at things in a historical sense of what people 250 years ago did? Why are we not considering, I don't know, maybe an amendment to really explain what the Establishment Clause is? I don't get why we can't add something to the Constitution, like an amendment to further clarify that, instead of saying, no, we have to go back and look back at 250 years ago, what people then did. And since they did it back then we have to do it now. I think that is just ridiculous. And besides that obvious glaring issue, the Establishment Clause clearly states that the government should not elevate one religion over another, and Bible reading in schools, using government funds, might I add, is clearly unconstitutional. And here's another interesting tidbit of information. So I was talking to my husband about this topic and this video, and we had just studied for the U.S. citizenship exam, which is 100 civics questions. And when I mentioned this topic and how religion is coming back into public schools, he actually quoted to me one of the questions from the U.S. citizenship civics exam. And that question is, what is freedom of religion? And he quoted to me, you can practice a religion or not practice a religion. So if immigrants coming to this country must memorize those questions and answers and already have an understanding that there is no official religion in this country, there is pure freedom of religion. If immigrants understand that concept, why do legislators not? Right? I don't care if the people who founded this country and settled in this country were generally religious. They didn't want one religion elevated over another, and that's why the Establishment Clause was written. Where is that discussion in this supposedly historical way of viewing the Constitution? Why are we not discussing why the Establishment Clause was written? Why are we not discussing the fact that religious people supported it and supported this separation of church and state, even though it didn't use those exact words? That was Jefferson. But where's this discussion when we're looking at the Constitution with a historical lens? Why is this not included in that historical discussion? I can't quite fathom how highly educated people, these legislators that are writing these acts, even got to this point. I don't understand how they processed this information, how they thought this through, and how they ignored such critical elements of history. I can't understand how they're interpreting the Supreme Court cases so differently now. I'm really struggling to understand how we got to this point. But so that was a lot of historical context before the actual proposed law. So let's look at the title here in this Idaho bill. It is School-Sponsored Bible Reading. I mean, just the title alone shows how unconstitutional it is. Remember that government funds shouldn't go towards supporting one religion or another, or non-religion in a public school. Well, the title alone says School-Sponsored Bible Reading. That's very clear that the school is sponsoring or funding Bible reading in public schools. This is like overturning all of the aforementioned Supreme Court cases that we talked about. And obviously, as we just looked at, legislators believe that the Coach Kennedy case overturned those Supreme Court cases, those previous decisions. I don't know if they actually have overturned those decisions, but I would argue that no, the Establishment Clause is very clear. You cannot make any law specifically supporting one religion or non-religion over another. So the Establishment Clause hasn't changed. I don't understand how they could even argue that this is constitutional, even with the Coach Kennedy case. Now, the actual law states that if approved, selections from 3 approved versions will be read each morning in all public schools so that the entire Bible is read sequentially over a period of 10 years. Okay, but wait. The good news is that there will be no comments or interpretations on the readings. How few. Oh, and also students and teachers can opt out if they so choose. But if a teacher opts out, then they'll just get a new teacher to replace them. So the students will still be listening to Bible reading. It's insane, guys. And this act finishes up with a note about how a parent, employee, or even a district resident can essentially snitch on a school if they are not implementing these Bible readings. So think about this. If someone in a school district who doesn't have a student in the public school system, but just some random person in the school district, they find out that the school is not including the Bible readings because the school, I don't know, maybe they decided that this was unconstitutional, like it is. So perhaps the school principal or the superintendent decided, you know what, we're not going to do that. Let's not say anything. We're just not going to do it. If someone in the school district finds out about it, they can go to the authorities and report the school. And then the law has to come in and force the school to implement these Bible readings. This is insane, guys. Craziness. Utter craziness. I want to point out that I found this news on the Idaho Freedom page, which is a conservative advocacy group. It interestingly pointed out that the act is not unconstitutional. In other words, it is constitutional based on a historical interpretation, like we talked about. But it does say that this act violates Article 9, Section 6 of the state's constitution, which says no sectarian or religious tenets or doctrines shall ever be taught in the public schools, and no books, papers, tracts, or documents of a political, sectarian, or denominational character shall be used or introduced in any schools. So that's very interesting. It violates the state constitution, but not the national, not the country's constitution. It's pretty interesting. So the act, from what I can see, the act attempts to skirt around the state constitution with a part about no comment or interpretation, so you're not teaching about the Bible. But the act is still proposing an introduction of the Bible in public schools, which would violate the state constitution. So because it violates the state constitution, hopefully it won't pass. But it is worrisome to me how the legislators are including the historical context and saying that because of the Coach Kennedy case, all of the previous Supreme Court decisions are essentially overturned, and that the Establishment Clause is now interpreted in a completely different manner, and that Bible reading is constitutional. So that's what is most worrisome to me. I don't think that this will pass because it is unconstitutional according to the state constitution, but the idea itself is worrisome. All right, let's move over to Oklahoma, which is just in a hell of a mess. I hate to say it, but it is. So we're going to first look at Senate Bill 36, which was first introduced in 2022, and it gained a lot of traction in 2024. It has since died in chamber, but I still want to talk about it because it is something that has and is happening in other states, and it also goes along with a Christian trend that is currently happening in the state. So the bill itself states that a school district may employ or accept one or more volunteer chaplains to provide support, services, and programs for students as assigned by the governing body of the school. They do not need to be certified. Fantastic. So what this essentially says is that a school can employ or have as a volunteer a chaplain to help students. It goes on to require background checks for the chaplains, which is good at least, but is still opening the door to religious figures in the public school. Now, the bill says that the chaplain services would be voluntary, and options include a minister, rabbi, priest, imam, lay leader, or similar functionary of the faith group. Now, this is ridiculous, of course, because it's literally a public school hiring a religious person of faith for their religious services in a public school. And unfortunately, that has been done before. So even though this bill died in chamber, it has been approved in Florida with the House Bill 931, and it was approved in 2024 to establish a volunteer chaplain program for public schools. So as in Florida, as in Oklahoma, at least they tried. These bills are extremely unconstitutional because they are approving government funds, again, to be used to support specific religious services in public schools. And yes, I know that it says the chaplains would be volunteers, but you still have to find chaplains, vet them, send out letters to families, organize where the chaplain is going to have meetings. Are they going to be always on campus or come in certain days? You need resources to figure these things out. And so who's going to do them? Are you going to use the school secretaries, the school guidance counselor? And if you're using those people to organize all of this, they're getting paid. So you're still using school resources to organize this program. Even if you're not directly paying the chaplain, government funds are essentially being funneled into this program to support religious figures in public school. And besides that, using anyone's services for free is just ridiculous and a slap in the face. I mean, chaplains, if they come into a place and are expected to offer their services, they should be paid, right? This is ridiculous, but I digress. Now, I do appreciate that this bill includes mention of various religions and various religious figures, but still, it is the school district's decision to employ or accept volunteers. And that means that they may reject people. And guess what? They already have. This bill wasn't even passed into law, and they already rejected people. The Satanic Temple offered chaplains to Oklahoma public schools, but Representative Kevin West and a national school chaplains group, I don't know what that is, but whatever, they have rejected TST's offers, saying that TST doesn't meet the requirements. How TST doesn't meet the requirements, I don't know. TST is specifically a self-identified religious group, and the bill specifically says, or similar functionary of the faith group. So by definition, TST chaplains would be approved. But it's crazy how only accepted religious groups are being included here, and we're openly discriminating against minority faith groups and faith groups that Christians don't really like. I hate to say that, but and unfortunately, this is history just repeating itself yet again after what happened with the Florida bill. So TST again expressed plans to send chaplains to Florida public schools, but the governor said, some have said that if you do a school chaplain program, that somehow you're going to have Satanists running around in all our schools. We're not playing those games in Florida. That is not a religion. That is not qualified to be able to participate in this. So we're going to be using common sense when it comes to this. You don't have to worry about it. Yes, DeSantis, let's use common sense here. TST is a religious organization, and it was created specifically to help support people oppressed by, I don't know, religious conservatives like you, DeSantis. I don't know. Crazy, right? We also have a worrisome directive from Oklahoma's top education official, Ryan Walters. It states, effective immediately, all Oklahoma schools are required to incorporate the Bible, which includes the Ten Commandments, as an instructional support into the curriculum across specified grade levels. This is not merely an educational directive, but a crucial step in ensuring our students grasp the core values and historical context of our country. Yeah, and screw all the other millions of non-Christians who have helped build and impact this country. No, only Christians and the Christian faith matter here, right? Now, this directive came right after the state's court ruled against what would have been the country's first religious charter public school. Walters was quoted saying, "You're not going to find the separation of church and state in the Constitution. It's not there. This is an argument that is based on a myth, on a lie." I don't know, Walters. Seems pretty clear to me. But if you remember back to the beginning of this video when I said that a lot of conservative Christians are using this argument that there is no separation of church and state to defend their legislation, well, This is a perfect example. The good news, though, is that Walters was a bit out of his depth, requiring immediate Bible teaching in all public schools across the state, according to the Oklahoma Attorney General, who, by the way, I have to point out, is openly Christian and yet still helped stop the state funding of religious public charter schools. Those are the types of Christians that I have no problem seeing in office, the ones who actually support religious freedom and true religious freedom. Anyways, the Attorney General said that Walters cannot legally require a change in curriculum. Walters is part of the state's Board of Education, which adopts academic standards, but each local district is responsible for choosing and implementing its specific curriculum. However, Walters is still extremely intent on getting Bibles into the classroom. He says, and I quote, "I will take every step possible to ensure Oklahoma students have the resources they need to fully understand American history." Oh, man. By acting now, Oklahoma is leading the country on a path toward greater focus on academic excellence by providing critical, historical, cultural, and literary context for our students. Oh boy, that's all kinds of worrisome and wrong. But he and the State Department of Education requested bids from Bible distributors in 2024 to get 55,000 leather-bound Bibles for public school students, plus copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the U.S. Constitution. While that bill was repealed, the group created another solicitation in February of 2025, and separately, the group already bought over 500 Bibles for AP U.S. government classes. And those Bibles cost $25,000. Now, after a whole discussion about the funds in Texas and over $100 million being approved for religious things in the classroom, $25,000 seems like a drop in the bucket. But that money could have been spent in much better ways. Say, I don't know, an updated curriculum that doesn't promote a specific religion? Maybe? Crazy idea, right? Also, that cost seems a tad steep for just 532 Bibles. Okay, $25,000 for 532 Bibles, that's a lot. I mean, just doing some simple math, that is about $47 for each Bible. That is insanely overpriced, especially when you can just download a Bible app for free. Not to mention the fact that if you give books to kids in a public school, those books will get destroyed and ruined. So spending $47 on a Bible that will undoubtedly get trashed in, I don't know, a few years, it seems like a very poor use of funds. But let's just give you an idea of how much a Bible can cost. So we're going to look it up. So here is a kid's Bible, which is crazy, $4. And here is another leather soft reference Bible. Oh, fancy. Right now it is marked down to $18. One idea I had is that maybe they're getting hard copy Bibles that might stand up to the wear and tear. But again, they don't cost $47. Okay, look, here's one for $11. I don't understand how they're spending about $50 for each Bible. I don't get it. And this is just a start. How much are they going to spend on the other 55,000 Bibles that they want? Right? Okay, update you guys. I found out what Bible they bought for the AP US government classes. Okay, it is Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA Bible. And of course, it sells at $59.99. So I assume that they got some sort of discount for buying in bulk. And in case you guys don't know, because I didn't know, Lee Greenwood is the one who released the song God Bless the USA. God bless the USA. And to me, this is super ironic because the lyrics of the song say, "I'm proud to be an American where at least I know I'm free." And this Bible is being pushed into public schools promoting a specific religion, which is therefore inhibiting religious freedom. So are we actually free in this country? Are public school students actually free to express their religious beliefs? I don't think so. And also this Lee Greenwood Bible is one of the ones promoted by Trump. So just leaving that there. On top of that, can I just mention that selling Bibles for about $50 to $100 just because they have a musician's name on it is so unbiblical and materialistic? Interestingly, purchasing these Bibles backfired a bit, according to a recent statement from Senator Pug. Sorry for mispronouncing your name. But according to the senator, the decision to purchase these 532 Bibles was not even considered in the subcommittee. So Walters is doing some sketchy things behind lawmakers' backs. And apparently purchasing these 532 Bibles affected his bid for the 55,000 because it was shut down. And besides the bids for the Bibles, Walters preemptively included a request for $3 million annually for Bibles in the budget. Why annually? Again, I do not know, but that is an insane amount. And what I do know is that teachers in this country are severely underpaid. Kids in many public schools don't have access to much needed tech in the classrooms. And food insecurity is a real thing for many students. So again, $3 million annually, is that really a good way to invest the money in purchasing Bibles? No. Thankfully, at the start of March in 2025, the state's lawmakers rejected the funding for the Bibles, and the Oklahoma Supreme Court paused Walter's second bid for classroom Bibles due to pending lawsuits. So we do have some good news there. However, there are still the 532 Bibles already purchased. And again, they are going to AP U.S. government classes, not religious studies classes, AP U.S. government classes. Just to satisfy my own curiosity, I looked up the AP U.S. government test, since, of course, the AP classes are designed to prepare students to take the test. So everything that's covered in the class should be what is on the test to set the students up for success, right? So let's look at the resources for the U.S. government test. Okay? Well, look at that. There is no mention of the Bible in the entire course and exam description. And it does have this to say: AP courses foster an open-minded approach to the histories and cultures of different peoples. The study of different nationalities, cultures, religions, races, and ethnicities is essential within a variety of academic disciplines. So if we're buying Bibles for these classes, where are all the other religious texts we're buying for these classes? There's also a whole section here on the First Amendment and freedom of religion, which is specifically topic 3.2. So my question is that if the Department of Education of Oklahoma is buying Bibles to incorporate into AP US government classes, how much misinformation are the teachers spreading? How are the teachers even going to include the Bible in their classes? Are they going to gloss over the First Amendment? Are they going to ignore other religions and other people groups? Are they going to purposely steer away from the predetermined content for this class? What happens if a student gets an open-ended question on the AP test talking about the First Amendment or religious freedoms, or even the establishment of this country and what influenced the establishment of this country? The students aren't going to be properly prepared for the test. Including the Bible in these classes is essentially setting the students up for failure. These kids aren't getting the education they need, not only for the AP test, but also for their future. And that's not the only thing that State Superintendent Walters is supporting. While he was out of his depth in requiring that the Bibles be incorporated into every classroom across the state, he and the board can set academic standards, and they are. Now get this, the state's academic standards are reviewed every 6 years, and 2025 is a lucky year for science and social studies. So they have developed a whole new set of standards for science and social studies, and they accepted comments and inputs on these standards up until January 21st of 2025. And while many teachers contributed, Walters also invited opinions from out-of-state conservative advocates like Dennis Prager. And you can just imagine what they had to say and how they impacted the standards. Let's look at some of the proposed inclusions of God and Christianity in the new standards. Now, just as a point of reference, I am going to pull up the 2019 K-12 standards, which have been used up until now. So we're going to do a quick search in this document. No mention of God, no mention of Judeo-Christian, no mention of Bible, no mention of the Old or New Testament, no mention of the Ten Commandments. One mention of Christianity introduced in a high school world history class along with other religions. And there's one mention of the Reformation. But again, that is just in one short world history objective about the causes and societal influences of the Reformation. Now let's move over to the proposed standards for 2025. We have 5 mentions of God, 6 mentions of Judeo-Christian, 6 mentions of Bible or biblical, 1 mention of Old and New Testaments, 2 mentions of the Ten Commandments, 15 mentions of Christianity, 3 mentions of the Reformation in a very detailed objectives section. Guys, I learned about the Reformation at home and in church, not very much in school. And these objectives include more details than the objectives for the fucking Renaissance. I mean, it's clearly promoting Christianity. So we're going to read a few so you can get an idea. And again, there is too much here to go into in this specific video. Again, I'm going to do a separate video going into these standards a bit more. But here is just a quick overview. So starting in first grade, we have an objective to explain the Pledge of the Allegiance and the significance of the phrase "under God." Another objective is to discuss the official motto, "In God We Trust," and the importance of religion to the American people. I would love to know what exactly they plan on teaching with this objective. Are they planning on teaching that this country was always supposedly a Christian nation? Or would they explain that this became the official motto in the 1950s during a time, might I add, that the country was embracing a very family and religious-based perspective to counteract the godless society of the Soviet Union during the Cold War? Would they go into that whole discussion? No, I mean, it's first grade. But how are they going to teach this to first graders? I'm very curious about this. And I would also love to know what they mean to teach about the importance of religion to Americans. Will they gloss over atheists and non-monotheists? Will they continue to lie that the country is or should be a Christian nation? There's also an objective to identify stories from ancient Israel that influenced the American colonists, founders, and culture. Stories like David and Goliath and the Ten Commandments. I'm sorry, but I don't remember those stories influencing the founders. Like, what? Now, all of this is happening in first grade. My son is around that age, and he generally parrots information that he's been told. He doesn't fully understand the concept of God or even concepts like love and hate, things that are more abstract. And even though we have talked about these terms in an age-appropriate manner, he still tends to repeat what we've said, and there's no deeper understanding there. So the fact that these standards are promoting things like "under God," "in God we trust," and really implementing these in these kids' minds, it's extremely worrisome to me. These students are still developing critical thinking skills, and some might still be struggling with the difference between fantasy and reality, and that's completely normal. So the fact that they're incorporating into the standards a discussion about God, the Bible, "in God we trust," "under God," this is borderline indoctrination. And on top of that, there's this whole debate on whether or not this country was actually founded on Christian principles. And I have to argue that it was not. But there is still a debate over that. And the fact that they're including it in first grade as fact, as history, is just, it's simply indoctrination. Moving on to second grade, we have some of the same objectives about the phrase "in God we trust." We also have an objective to identify even more Christian stories that influence the American colonists, founders, and culture, including Jesus' teaching like the Golden Rule. Now, I already said that the Golden Rule wasn't exactly Jesus' teaching, but remind me again how these stories influence the colonists and founders. I'd also like to point out that the objectives about Bible stories in first and second grade allow teachers to essentially provide a broad overview of both the Old and the New Testament, or in other words, the whole Bible. This is explicit Bible teaching. The objectives do not say identify religious values that influence some early settlements. No, it says identify Christian Bible stories. In second grade, there is also an objective about examining how different virtues guided the lives of people who made a positive difference in their communities around the world. At first glance, this sounds a little bit better. It's specifically virtues, not Christian stories. However, really looking into this objective, it's concerning because it focuses on how the virtues guided these people's decisions. And all of the examples provided of potential figures that could be talked about are people that are religious, and most of whom could be related to Christianity. And besides that, many of these figures are extremely controversial. Again, I'll get into this in more detail in my other video, but here's just one example. It mentions Winston Churchill. Now, he wasn't a conventional fundamentalist Christian, but he was someone who believed in a higher power and someone who also believed in combining politics and religion. And he was also a drunk and a racist. So I would love to hear about how his virtues guided his decisions. Okay, do you see how this can become extremely problematic? Not only are they choosing people who are openly religious, often Christian, but they're choosing people who have been controversial. And so they're only looking at the good parts or the good things that these people have done. So again, we're talking about cherry picking history facts, right? Third grade standards include Judeo-Christian ideas a bit more subtly. So this standard focuses on the preamble to the Oklahoma Constitution and how it reflects the people's reliance on spiritual guidance. And I looked it up. The preamble does talk about God. And while that is concerning in and of itself, this standard is even more so. The main standard is to analyze the purpose of government and the traits of responsible citizens. Religion should have no part here. Including religion implies that to be a good citizen, you have to rely on spiritual guidance. Now, the next standard analyzes significant historical events and how different peoples contributed to the state's development. All fine and good. But, wait for it, there's a subsection about different people groups' origin stories, and the standards say to teach native oral histories and the Hebrew creation story. I don't know about you, but this seems like a very weird place to talk about stories about the origin of the universe. This is a section about historical events, and there's no historical evidence about the creation of the universe. So it's a little bit weird. And plus, it's specifically historic events that contributed to the state's development, and going all the way back to the origin of the universe is a bit excessive to me. I don't know. And while I appreciate the inclusion of native oral stories, this isn't the place for them. That would be more in a religious or cultural section. And besides all of that, even if it was in a religious or cultural section, what does the Hebrew origin story have to do with Oklahoma? I don't get it. I don't know. It just feels to me like they wanted an excuse to include the story of creation. Simple as that. The last objective I review here is a bit interesting. It focuses on the African Americans who migrated to Oklahoma from the South. Now, this is totally fine and on topic. However, there is an emphasis in the standard that they were called exodusters in reference to the biblical Exodus. Now, while this is all historical, this did happen, it is fine to talk about, we should talk about it. I want to point out that this is weird because it was not included in the 2019 standards. And here in the 2025 standards, it is included with a note to talk about the biblical Exodus. So again, I feel like they're including these standards to give an excuse to talk about Bible stories like Moses and the Exodus. I don't think that they wanted to include it here specifically so that teachers can talk about why African Americans were leaving the South, but instead to focus on, oh, they were called exodusters. Let's talk about the Exodus, right? Phew, that was a lot for religious standards, and those were only for the first 3 grades. On February 27th of 2025, these standards were approved by the Oklahoma State Board of Education. These standards now move on to the state legislature, which will decide whether they approve them by the end of May. And if they are approved, they will be incorporated for the school year for 2025 to 2026. Now, in spite of all of this, we have some slightly good news. The American Historical Association has made an official statement regarding Walter's directive to include the Bible in classrooms. This isn't in regards to the standards that he developed, but the directive itself, which was shot down. So this is the response from the American Historical Association. Oklahoma students deserve to learn about the complex and nuanced conversations among early national America's already diverse religious traditions, the Constitution, and the First Amendment. This order violates that right, threatening the integrity of history instruction in public education and the basic constitutional rights of Oklahomans. To date, 18 organizations have signed on to the statement. Now, I'm glad that a historical association has responded to what Walters is doing, even if it is just the directive and not the standards, because it is calling out just how inaccurate this historical perspective is and just how much damage it is doing to students in the public education system. Now, I would love to see the same response regarding the standards. I haven't seen much conversation about it. I don't know if it's because people don't want to sit down and read standards, but I would love to hear the same uproar and the same backlash regarding these standards because they have already passed the first step of approval and they are likely to be implemented in the upcoming school year. And we need to stop it because if they are implemented, that's 6 years of incorporating Christianity into public schools in Oklahoma. All right, we have one more bill in Oklahoma to discuss, and it is from Oklahoma Representative Jim Olson. And he has resurrected yet another bill. The first version of the bill died in 2024, but with recent turnover in the Oklahoma House, Representative Olson thought to reintroduce it with cautious optimism. Plus, recent bills in West Virginia that were initially rejected have been approved, so if in West Virginia, why not Oklahoma? Let's try this bill again. So, what is the bill, you ask? Putting the 10 Commandments in the classroom, just like in Texas. So just like the proposed bill in Texas, the posters of the 10 Commandments must be 16 by 20 inches and placed in a conspicuous location. Similarly, schools must also accept donated posters or framed copies. Now, unlike the Texas bill, this one doesn't explicitly say that the schools must use their own funds. However, I do feel like that's implied because how are you going to get donations for every single public classroom across the entire state? Now, to be fair, there are fewer schools in Oklahoma, only about 1,720. So doing the same comparison in cost, we would be looking at only about $1.3 million for posters. But still, that's freaking ridiculous to spend on religious posters. Let's move over a few states to Iowa. Just like we had the curriculum concerns in Texas and the standard concerns in Oklahoma, Iowa is on the same path. So Senate Bill 138 in Iowa has received initial approval from the state's Education Subcommittee. Why is this concerning? Because the bill provides standards for adopting Bible classes in public schools. Yes, you heard that correctly. Bible classes in public schools. Now, the bill lists these Bible classes just as electives for grades 9 through 12, and potential courses include Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament, the New Testament, or both the Old and the New Testament. These courses would be approved for supposedly academic purposes, which include providing students with knowledge of biblical content, characters, poetry, and narratives that are prerequisites to understanding contemporary society. This sounds a lot like the Texas curriculum that forces Bible stories where they don't belong, right? Like a story about King David before reading Psalms 23 in a poetry unit in 5th grade. Another approved purpose to include Bible electives is to use the Bible classes to familiarize students with the content, history, literary styles, and or influence of the Bible. Now, I'm not saying the Bible has no influence on culture or no historical relevance. Of course it does. However, it is not the only influence on culture and history. If schools approve Bible electives, why not include electives about the Quran, about other religious texts? Yeah? But no, of course not. The bill even includes a clause saying that a course offered under the bill is subject to federal and state guidelines regarding religion neutrality and shall recognize and accommodate the diverse religion views, traditions, and perspectives of students enrolled in the school district. Such a course shall not endorse, favor, promote, or disfavor or be hostile toward any particular religion, faith, or non-religious perspective. Now, that's a whole lot of fancy sounding bullshit, right? If a course were actually offering a neutral, unbiased information that doesn't endorse or favor any one religion, it would not be a course just on the Bible. It would be a religious studies course, or perhaps a series of religious studies electives. Just slapping something on a bill saying that it's neutral and unbiased doesn't actually make it neutral and unbiased. And besides the not-so-subtle push of Judeo-Christian beliefs, these electives promote, yet again, a twisted view of U.S. history and culture. Dare I say it? It's yet again another curriculum change that promotes Christian nationalism as true history. Disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. And completely ignorant on the effects that other religions and other people groups have had on this country. The good news, I guess, is that these are electives and not mandatory courses. Also, the school board would get to vote on whether to include them or not. However, if the school board does approve these electives, that means a whole lot more of government funds would go to religious courses. Not only funds for new materials and Bibles, but also funds to train teachers. And again, we're talking probably in the millions. Now, I'm all for paid training for teachers, 100%, but not for glorified Sunday school classes. Okay? I mean, come on. And I'm not the only one who thinks these classes are a bit too Sunday school-y. Connie Ryan from Interfaith Alliance of Iowa says the following. The very nature of this legislation, as written, gives preference in law to one religion over all others. Bible-specific courses and scores can become nothing more than Sunday school lessons masquerading as instruction about religion. The outcome of narrowly focused Bible courses often becomes a way to endorse one religious perspective in public schools, insisting on a conservative evangelical Christian view and promoting that with public school students. I couldn't agree more. And this brings up a very important point. These courses would undoubtedly be promoting Christianity, not Judaism, or at least not authentic Judaism. Even with the elective option with Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament, which should theoretically explore Judaism, not Christianity, the elective is phrased in terms of the Christian Bible. It's not called Exploring the Torah and other ancient Jewish texts. No, it's specifically mentioning the Old Testament, and I highly doubt they include any other religious texts outside of the Old Testament. So this is giving a very Christian look at what was originally Jewish texts. So again, not only does this promote one religion over the other, in other words, Christianity over Judaism, but it also provides a distorted view of another religion, Judaism, because you're looking at these texts with a Christian lens, not a Jewish lens, as they were originally written. And speaking of distorted views, how would these electives be taught? I would love to know. Would the Bible stories be presented as history or myths? Would they be taught alongside archaeological evidence or lack thereof? Will there be a discussion on the positive and negative effects the Bible has had on the world? Or will there just be a focus on the positive effects? You see where I'm going with this. You see why I have concerns with this, right? Unfortunately, preliminary approval from the Education Committee does not bode well, and this bill might actually pass. The General Assembly could still vote no, but the fact that the whole Committee on Education approved this is just absolutely mind-boggling to me. A recent article cited some of the reasons that people support this bill, and a major one, besides the supposedly massive impact that the Bible has had on U.S. history and culture, is the effects of biblical literacy. So apparently, knowing about the Bible leads to a better ability to not only understand our history and other faiths, but also a better ability to read works from authors like Charles Dickens and Tolstoy. Now, I'm really struggling to understand this train of thought. Perhaps reading the Bible in the New King James Version, an older version, might make it easier for students to then go on and read Charles Dickens and Tolstoy. But if that's true, then the opposite also applies. If you start with reading Charles Dickens, then it would be easier to read other texts like Tolstoy and Shakespeare, right? Or if you start with Shakespeare, then you can read other more difficult texts. Why does it have to start with the Bible? I don't really get it. And also, how does reading the Bible help us understand people of other faiths? It honestly does just the opposite, right? The Abington District versus Shemp case was also cited. And if you remember back to the beginning of this video, that was the case that deemed it unconstitutional to include Bible reading and recited prayer in public schools. So while some legislators in other states are saying that the Abington versus Shemp case was overturned with the Coach Kennedy case, legislators in Iowa are looking at it a bit differently, saying that you can bring certain religious classes into public schools as long as it is part of a non-biased secular curriculum. So my first question here is the Abington versus Shemp case overturned or not? Because we have some conflicting opinions across the country. And my second question is, are Bible electives in public schools part of a non-biased secular curriculum? I would have to say no. A secular non-biased curriculum would include electives on all religions, not just one. All right, let's move over to the South and talk about some education bills in the Bible Belt. We've already talked about Texas and we've mentioned Florida briefly, but there is so much more in the works, specifically in Louisiana, Georgia, and South Carolina. Let's start with Louisiana, which has essentially laid the groundwork for some of the aforementioned bills regarding the 10 Commandments in public school classrooms. As we've talked about, some states have pending bills to include the 10 Commandments on posters or frame copies in public school classrooms. But in Louisiana, that bill was already passed into law. Louisiana House Bill 71 was passed in June of 2024, and it went into effect in January of 2005, despite an opposing ruling from a federal judge. Now, like the other acts, this one in Louisiana requires all classrooms in the state to display either a framed copy of the 10 Commandments or a poster. The size is a bit smaller. The requirement is only 11 by 14 inches, but the commandments still need to be in a large font that is legible. This bill also differs slightly from the ones in other states because it includes a requirement that each display include a so-called context statement about why including the Ten Commandments is important. It's essentially 3 paragraphs talking about how previously schools and textbooks incorporated the Ten Commandments into public education. The bill also explicitly says that the schools don't have to use their funds to buy the posters, which I guess is good, but they still have to get them. So how are they going to do that? They can either accept donated funds or donated posters. But what if they don't get the donations? Is there an organization that is going to just hand out funds or posters to every school in the state? Probably not. A later section in the bill says that free materials will be provided, and they're available online, but that doesn't cover the printing costs, which would be quite high if you're going to print out fairly large posters in color for every single classroom in your school, right? And also, get this, it's not just K through 12 schools that are required to do this. It is post-secondary schools as well, or public colleges and universities. Now, how in the world did this get passed? Well, let me tell you. The bill has an introduction listing reasons why putting the Ten Commandments in the classroom is actually constitutional. It claims that the Ten Commandments are a core part of U.S. history and faithfully reflects the understanding of the founders of our nation with respect to the necessity of civic morality to a functional self-government. Now, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of how the Ten Commandments and Christianity are not foundational aspects of this country in this particular video. However, I do want to point out that this bill has cherry-picked information to defend its reasoning of why including the Ten Commandments in the classroom is constitutional. And some of that information that it has cherry-picked is sometimes incorrect. So we're going to take a look at it in detail. Now, first of all, it cites the Van Orden versus Perry case, which ultimately approved a monument of the Ten Commandments on Texas state capitol grounds. Now, while this case established that it was constitutional to include this monument on state grounds, the dissenting opinion from Judge Sauter explains how a previous case, Stone versus Graham in 1980, specifically discussed displaying Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. And that case determined it was completely unconstitutional. And the reason being is twofold. One, the Ten Commandments are a sacred text in Jewish and Christian faiths. And two, the commandments do not confine themselves to secular matters, instead discussing how you must only worship one God and not take that God's name in vain. So in this bill in Louisiana that has been passed into law, it is mentioning one specific case that said you can have a monument of the Ten Commandments on government grounds, but it's conveniently overlooking a more relevant case about having the Ten Commandments in public education and how that case determined it was unconstitutional. So you're taking something that doesn't necessarily apply in this case and saying, oh, well, that's constitutional, so now in public classrooms it is constitutional, and we're just conveniently ignoring the case that determined having the Ten Commandments in public classrooms was unconstitutional. Isn't it convenient to ignore evidence that doesn't align with the views that you want to promote? Doesn't that sound like confirmation bias? Maybe. Now, this bill's introduction also states the American Legion versus American Humanist Association case, saying that it ruled that the displaying of the Ten Commandments on public property may have multiple purposes, such as historical significance, and represent a common cultural heritage. Now, interestingly, this case had nothing to do with the Ten Commandments. It was specifically about portraying a cross on public grounds. Does the case mention the Ten Commandments? Yes, but primarily in reference to the case about the monument in Texas. So I see this as a secondary source because this case isn't about the Ten Commandments. It references a previous case. So here's the case in Texas, and this case about the cross references this case. So we're looking at a secondary source, right? And it just feels a bit dishonest to include this case as yet another reason to include the Ten Commandments in the classroom when this case doesn't even directly talk about the Ten Commandments and just references a previous case. And finally, the third reason that this bill claims that including the Ten Commandments in the classroom is constitutional is because James Madison supposedly wrote the following: "We have staked the whole future of our new nation upon the capacity of each of ourselves to govern ourselves according to the moral principles of the Ten Commandments." Surprise, surprise, this is not a real quote from Madison. Okay, talk about fake news, right? Madison actually vehemently opposed the mixing of government and religion. And this quote, supposedly from Madison, has been debunked numerous times that he did not actually say this. So out of the 3 reasons that we have for defending the use of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms, the first one is valid but ignores evidence to the contrary. The second one is a secondary source referring back to the first one. And the third one is just simply false. Okay, so these are supposed reasons for the constitutionality of including the Ten Commandments in the classroom. And I have found errors in each and every one of them. Again, I struggle to understand the thought process that these legislators have when writing these laws. I really struggle how highly educated people can write these things and think, yeah, that is a solid argument. I don't get it. Now, remember how I said a federal judge opposed this law? Well, District Judge John DeGravels, sorry for my pronunciation, recognized just how unconstitutional this bill was, and he rejected a state mandate telling schools to post the Ten Commandments. However, supporters of this bill obviously found a workaround. So according to the state's Attorney General, Liz Murrill, the judge's ruling can only apply to 5 local school boards named as the defendants in the pending lawsuit. All the other 67 school districts are subject to the law. Convenient, huh? The Attorney General, Liz Murrill, also came forward in January with some helpful guidance on how to constitutionally post the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. She says, and I quote, "As I have repeatedly said, House Bill 71 is plainly constitutional because there are constitutionally sound ways to implement it. Like not hanging the Ten Commandments behind the teacher's desks because that would give an impression that the teacher specifically supports it. But having the school support it, is that any better? I don't think so." Liz Murrill conveniently offered 4 example posters for classrooms to use, and these are the free resources that I talked about, and we're going to take a look at them. So poster 1, the history of the Ten Commandments in the classroom, or the 3 context paragraphs that are required, is on incredibly tiny print right at the bottom. Same with the note about the portraits in the Capitol building and how they all look towards Moses. So I find that funny because nobody will actually read such fine print. So why are you including context if nobody's actually going to read it? I think it's just a way to say this is constitutional without actually opening up the discussion for history. And can we talk about how this poster highlights the Speaker of the House the same as Moses? I mean, no disrespect to Mike Johnson, but it seems like a strange decision when talking about lawmakers. This country specifically has a system of checks and balances, so it's not just one person creating the laws. It's a whole process, and you have a lot of people contributing. So I don't know why we have Mike Johnson here when we talk about lawmakers. He doesn't make the laws. It's strange to me. And technically, Moses isn't a lawmaker either. He was just the one who wrote down what he received from God, supposedly, according to the story. So neither of these people are lawmakers. I don't get this poster. My verdict is that poster 1 is manipulative and misconstrued. Moving on to poster 2. Again, we have some super small text talking about the history of the Ten Commandments in education. And we also have another note about art, but this time from the Supreme Court building. And here we have a focus on 3 people, Moses, of course. And then we also have William Blackstone, an Englishman who cited the Ten Commandments as foundational for the law, and also John Marshall, one of the early judges in the United States. And I think that the only one that actually pertains to U.S. government and law would be John Marshall. So this poster gets a point for that, and only 1 point. Moving on to poster 3. All right, so we got some fancy new font here. The history of the Ten Commandments is bigger this time, but then again, so are the Ten Commandments. Unfortunately here, the highlighted figures are those who included the Ten Commandments in public school textbooks several years ago. And look at this note at the bottom. It says, "This is the version of the Ten Commandments upheld by the Supreme Court in Van Orden versus Perry, but different faith traditions adopt different versions." Now, again, the Van Orden versus Perry is the one about the Ten Commandment monument in Texas. And I couldn't find specifically in the case where it endorses a specific version of the Ten Commandments. It was more about the monument being on government property than about endorsing a specific version of the Ten Commandments. And on top of that, I'm not quite sure what they mean about different faith traditions adopting different versions, because in the Bible alone, no matter what version you look at, there are 4 different versions of the 10 Commandments. So it seems a little bit misinformed. Ultimately, I think this poster is trash. The title says Religion's Role in American Public Education, and then only talks about one aspect of true religions. This isn't a study of the role of religion. This is a study of the 10 Commandments in schools. And again, only through a notably Christian lens, not a Jewish one. So again, trash. And poster 4, this is hilariously awful. The title is The Supreme Court and the Religion Clauses of the Constitution. Does it anywhere talk about supposed religion clauses? No. Does it give an explanation of the Supreme Court decisions? No. But it does conveniently have the Texas 10 Commandment monument front and center with a note that says it is constitutional. The top 2 images are also noted as constitutional. Do you recognize the first one? Yeah, Coach Kennedy. Of course. And the one on the right is the cross from the American Legion versus American Humanist Association case. And the bottom 2 images are of unconstitutional 10 Commandment displays, which is very interesting to me because these displays have only the 10 Commandments. And this is essentially what other states like Texas are promoting in their pending bills. So just a poster of the 10 Commandments. But this poster here, which has been approved by the state and is now law, you can now go print this out and put in public schools. This poster says that these are unconstitutional displays of the 10 Commandments. So other states are saying that this is constitutional, and Louisiana says it isn't constitutional because it doesn't have any historical context. We're just getting opposing views all across the board. I don't know. So those are the posters that have been approved for Louisiana public schools. Now, Georgia is following in Louisiana's footsteps. Legislators have put together a bill requiring the display of the 10 Commandments in schools, but not just the 10 Commandments. These posters would be required to have a historical context section so that they are constitutional, supposedly constitutional, just like the ones that were approved in Louisiana. Quite literally, the required historical context is word for word identical to what is required in Louisiana, and I don't think this is a coincidence. You cannot tell me this is a coincidence. I feel that legislators have seen a way to put Christianity back in public schools, and they are jumping on the chance. This Georgia Bill 313 also explains that schools do not need to use any funds since there will be free resources and or donations. Now, I've already explained why this is unrealistic. Expecting every school to receive enough donations is just not possible. And then even if you get the free resources online, you still have all of the printing costs. This bill differs slightly from the Louisiana one because it requires posters to be slightly bigger, 16 by 20 inches, and it also specifies different locations for the posters. Instead of in every classroom, the 10 Commandments posters must be displayed in locations where they can be easily read by both students and adults. Possible locations include the main entrance of the building, the main entrance of the school library or media center, and the main entrance of the cafeteria. And I honestly think this is worse than having the posters in the classrooms because this is open and overt propaganda. You can't tell me that you're trying to teach students about the connection between U.S. history and the 10 Commandments if you're putting these posters in the main entrance of the school. What goes in the main entrance of the school? That's where you put up things like school pride. You put up pictures of the sports teams. You put up the school colors. You put up things that say, this is our school and we are proud. So if you put up a display of the 10 Commandments at the entrance of your school, you are saying that we are a Christian school, and we proudly say that we are a Christian school. That does not belong in public schools. The reasoning behind this bill is, again, supposedly history. This bill includes the same points as the Louisiana one, plus a few, which I'm going to briefly cover. It mentions the Mayflower Compact of 1620 as America's first written constitution. Now, keep in mind that this was written before the Pilgrims even got to America. You can't tell me that a document written by a religious group before they even got to a specific area is now considered the standard for our government and society. Just because the Mayflower Compact includes a mention of a covenant with God does not mean that the country founded 150 years after it was written should now be focused on biblical principles. This bill also cites the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 because it says that religion and morality are necessary to good government. But what this bill conveniently overlooks is that the Northwest Ordinance also includes in the first article that nobody should be persecuted because of religion. So again, cherry picking information, right? So this Georgia bill, again, just goes to show the incredibly worrisome pattern occurring across the US of legislators viewing and using only the pieces of history that help push their religious agendas. And last but not least, we have South Carolina. And yes, you guessed it, there is yet again a bill promoting the display of the Ten Commandments in public schools. Compared to the Louisiana and Georgia bills, this one is fairly short. It doesn't include a lengthy introduction justifying their twisted reasoning for including the Ten Commandments in public schools. It also doesn't include any size requirements for the posters. It just says that the poster has to be legible. The bill does clarify, though, that schools can use public funds if they don't have any donations or just random Ten Commandments posters laying around. While only 3 representatives originally supported the bill, 9 other representatives signed on as sponsors after its initial reading in January, unfortunately. Also in South Carolina, we have Senate Bill 122, which, if passed, would allow for chaplains in public schools, just like the bill passed in Florida and the one that was shot down in Oklahoma. However, there is one major difference, and it is that the bill in South Carolina would allow schools to employ chaplains, not just bring them in as volunteers. In other words, it would approve government funds be used to bring in members of religious groups into public schools. And again, I have to ask, which faith? If it were up to the school, which type of chaplain would they hire? A Muslim imam? A Buddhist priest? An ordained member of the Satanic Temple? Will there be a paid chaplain from every major religious group? I highly doubt it. I mean, let's be honest, they will probably get Christian chaplains, right? Now, after all this depressing news about the disintegration of public education and the now non-existent separation of church and state, let's end the video on a somewhat positive note, talking about the Dakotas. Both North and South Dakota have rejected religious-based bills introduced in 2025. So the North Dakota House Bill 1456 was about volunteer or employed chaplains in public schools, and it failed within 1 month of its introduction. Pretty quick. 57% voted against it. In South Dakota, the Senate Bill 51 failed after gaining some traction. It would have required the inclusion of the Ten Commandments in classrooms and instruction. Senate members had voted to amend it, and they ended up adding a section stating that the Attorney General would provide free legal representation for the school in case of any legal cases in regards to this bill. However, after they included that amendment, the bill then failed, and just barely. There were 34 votes for and 37 against. So there is some hope that not all of these religious bills will pass, but as I've said, some of the bills have already been pushed forward, like in Texas. So only time will tell. So that wraps up this incredibly long video about Christianity coming back into public schools. Let me know what you think about these bills, the ones that have passed, the ones that are pending, and if you have heard about any outrageous bills happening in your state. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can stay tuned for more videos about deconstruction from Christianity, Christianity and education, and so much more. Until next time.